The Weirdstone of Brisingamen by Garner. Read by Robert Powell. The Legend of Alderley. At dawn one October day, in the long ago of the world, across the hill of Alderley, a farmer from Mobberley was riding to Macclesfield Fair. He drew near to the place known as Thieves' Hole, and there the horse stood still. In the middle of the path was an old man, tall, with long hair and beard. "You go to sell this mare," he said. "I come here to buy. What is your price?" But the farmer wished to sell only at the market, where he would have a choice of many offers, so he bade the stranger let him through. "Then go your way," said the old man. "None will buy, and I shall await you here at sunset." The next moment he was gone. All who saw the mare agreed that she was a splendid animal, but no one offered to buy. A sour-eyed farmer rode out of Macclesfield at the end of the day. Near Thieves' Hole the mare stopped. The stranger was there, and the farmer agreed to sell. By Seven Firs and Goldenstone they went, to Stormy Point and Saddle Bowl, and they halted before a great rock embedded in the hillside. The old man lifted his staff and touched the rock, and it split with the noise of thunder. "Do not be afraid," said the wizard, "for living wonders you shall see here." Beyond the rock stood a pair of iron gates. These the wizard opened, and took the farmer and the horse down a tunnel deep into the hill. They stepped into a cave, and there a wondrous sight met the farmer's eyes. 140 knights in silver armour, and by the side of all but one, a milk-white mare. "Here they lie in enchanted sleep," said the wizard, "until the day will come when England shall be in direst peril. Then out from the hill these must ride, and in a battle thrice lost, thrice won upon the plain, drive the enemy into the sea." The farmer turned with the wizard into a further cavern, and here lay mounds of gold and silver and precious stones. "Take what you can carry in payment for the horse." And when the farmer had crammed his pockets with jewels, the wizard hurried him up the tunnel and thrust him out of the gates. The thunder rolled. The farmer looked, and there was only the rock above him. He was alone on the hill, near Stormy Point. And although in later years he tried to find the place, neither he nor any after him ever saw the iron gates again. The platform of Wilmslow station was thick with people, but Colin and Susan had no difficulty in recognizing Gowther Mossock. "Hello, I'm thinking you mun be Colin and Susan." "That's right," said Colin. "Let's be having you," said Gowther. "Bessie's getting supper, and we're not home yet." They made their way to the station yard, where there stood a green farm cart with high red wheels, and between the shafts was a white horse. They soon left the village behind and round a corner. Before them, rising abruptly out of the fields a mile away, was a long-backed hill. Outlined against the sky were the towers and spires of big houses showing above the trees. "Yon's th' edge," said Gowther. "You'll have some grand times there, I can tell you." Nearer they came to the edge, until it towered above them. The trees came right down to the road, tall beeches, which seemed to be whispering to each other in the breeze. "It's a bit creepy, isn't it?" said Susan. "Aye, there's some as reckons it is, but you munna always listen to what folks say. We're getting close to Alderley village now, Sithy, Now here's where we come to a bit of steep." They began to climb. It was very steep, but the horse plodded along until the road levelled out. They were on top of the edge now, and through gaps in the trees they caught glimpses of lights twinkling on the plain far below. Then they turned down a lane which brought them, at the last light of day, to a small farmhouse lodged in a fold of the edge. This was the end of the children's journey. Highmost Redmanhay, where a Mossock had farmed for 3 centuries and more. "Hurry on in," said Gowther. "Bess'll be waiting supper for us." Bess Mossock, before her marriage, had been nurse to the children's mother. She greeted them warmly. "It'll do this old farmhouse a world of good to have a couple of childer brighten it up for a few months." "If it's all right with you," said Colin the next day, "we'd like to go in the wood and see what's there." "You go and enjoy yourselves," said Gowther. "But when you're up the edge, sees as you dunna venture down any caves, and keep an eye open for holes in the ground. Yon place is riddled with tunnels and shafts from the old copper mines. If you went down there and got lost, that'd be the end of you. Even if you missed falling down a hole, you'd wander about in the dark until you upped and died." "We'll be careful," said Colin. It was strange to find an inn there on that road, a village inn without a village. It was named The Wizard, and above the door was fixed a painted sign of a man dressed like a monk with long white hair and beard. Behind him a peasant held the reins of a white horse. They left the road for the wood, and walked among fir and pine, oak, ash, and silver birch, along tracks through bracken and sleek hummocks of grass. And then, abruptly, they came upon a stretch of rock and sand. The Cheshire plain spread before them, dotted with farms and houses. Here the edge dropped steeply for several hundred feet, while away to their right the country rose in folds and wrinkles until it joined the bulk of the Pennines 8 miles away. "Look here," said Susan. "This must be one of the mines." At their feet a narrow trench sloped into the rock. "Come on," said Colin. "There's no harm in going down a little way, just as far as the daylight reaches." They walked down the trench, and were disappointed to find that it ended in a small cave full of cold, damp air. There were no tunnels or shafts. The only thing of note was a round hole in the roof. "Huh," said Colin. "There's nothing dangerous about this, anyway." All through the afternoon, Colin and Susan roamed up and down the wooded hillside and along the valleys of the edge. Just as they were about to turn for home, the children came upon a stone trough into which water was dripping from an overhanging cliff, and high in the rock was carved the face of a bearded man, and underneath was engraved, "Drink of this, and take thy fill, for the water falls by the wizard's will." "The wizard again," said Susan. "We really must find out from Gowther what all this is about. Let's go straight home now and ask him." They were within sight of the farm, when a car overtook them and pulled up sharply. A woman got out and stood waiting for the children. "Is this the road to Macclesfield?" she said. "I'm afraid I don't know," said Colin. "We've only just come to stay here." "Oh, then you'll want a lift. Jump in." "Thanks," said Colin, "but we're living at this next farm." "Get into the back." "No, really, it's only a few yards." "Get in." The woman's eyes glinted. "You will get into the back." "Honestly, it's not worth the bother." The woman drew breath through her teeth, and she began to whisper to herself. Colin felt most uncomfortable. "Optator," said the woman. I beg your pardon?" "Lapidator." "I'm sorry?" "Somniator. Are you qui liberta opera facitis?" "I'm not much good at Latin." Colin wanted to run. She must be mad. His brow was damp with sweat, and pins and needles were taking all awareness out of his body. Then, close at hand, a dog barked. The woman gave a cry of rage and spun round. The tension broke, and Colin saw that his fingers were round the handle of the car door, and the door was half open. "Out the noise, scamp," said Gowther. That's Mr. Mossock," said Colin. "He'll be able to tell you the way to Macclesfield." "No doubt," snapped the woman. She threw herself into the car and drove away. "Well," said Colin, What was all that about? She must be off her head. I thought she was having a fit. All the time you were talking to her, I thought I was going to faint, said Susan. And my tear has gone all misty. Susan was fond of her tear. It was a small piece of crystal, shaped like a raindrop. It was mounted in a socket fastened to a silver chain bracelet, which Susan always wore. It was flawless stone, but when she was very young, Susan had discovered that if she held it so that it caught the light, she could see, deep in the heart of the crystal, a twisting column of blue fire, always moving, never ending, and alive. "Oh, if it isn't the Brightstone," said Bess Mossock, when she saw the tear. "And after all these years. Yon pretty dewdrop were given to me by my mother. My mother had it from her mother, and she always said it had been passed down like that for I dunno know how many years. I gave it to your mother because it always used to catch the children's eyes. I've no children of me own, and thy mother was the same as a daughter to me." So Susan's tear had continued to sparkle at her wrist until that moment at the car, when it had suddenly clouded over, the colour of whey. "And what did old Selina Place want with you?" said Gowther. "It's not often you see her bothering with folks." "She stopped to ask the way to Macclesfield." "But that's daft. Selina Place has lived in Alderley for as long as I can remember. Hers is one of the big houses on the back hill. She lives alone there with her dogs, and they're more like wolves to my way of thinking. I've heard them howling of a winter's night, and it's a noise I shanna forget in a hurry." "She seemed to think that we'd want a lift," said Colin. "But as soon as she saw you, she jumped into the car and drove away." "It's as well to keep clear of the likes of her," said Gowther. "Now then, from what you tell me, I can see as how you've been a tidy step this afternoon. Yon place where you say there was such a grand view is Stormy Point, and the cave with the hole in the roof is the Devil's Grave. If you run round there 3 times widdershins, how'd Nick's supposed to come up and fetch you?" "What about the wizard?" said Susan. "I've been saving the wizard till the end." And Gowther told Colin and Susan the legend of Alderley. "Is it a true story?" said Colin. "There's some as reckons it is, but I say yon's nobbut a legend." "Yes," said Susan, "but you know, Dad always says there's no smoke without a fire." "Aye, happen he's getting summat there," laughed Gowther. Gowther pointed to a large black bird that was circling above the farmyard. "Hey, see thee yon carrion crow? If he dunna shift himself soon, I'll take me shotgun to him. Crows are a reet menace in the lambing season." Early in the evening, Colin suggested another walk on the edge, this time to find the iron gates. "Aye, well, I wish you luck. You're not the first to try, and I dunna suppose you'll be the last." Colin and Susan roamed all over Stormy Point, but there were so many rocks and boulders, any of which could have hidden the gates, that they soon tired, and instead sat down just beneath the crest of a spur of the edge, and watched the sun drop towards the rim of the plain. "I think it's time we were going," said Susan, when the sun had almost disappeared. "If we don't reach the road before dark, we could easily lose our way." Susan followed Colin over the crest of the hill. They found themselves in a dell, in which were cracks and fissures and small caves, and before them was a high-vaulted beechwood. The air was still and heavy, as though waiting for thunder, the only sound the concentrated whine of mosquitoes, and a thick, sweet smell of bracken and flies was everywhere. I don't like this place, Colin," said Susan. "I feel that we're being watched." Colin, too, had that feeling between the shoulder blades, and he could easily have imagined that something was moving among the shadows of the rocks. So he gladly turned to climb back to the path. Colin stopped and laughed. "Look, somebody is watching us." Perched on a rock in front of them was a bird. Its head was thrust forward, and it stared unwinkingly at the 2 children. "It's the carrion crow that was round the farm," cried Susan. "Talk sense! How can you tell it's the same one? There are probably dozens of them about here." All the same, Colin did not like the way the bird sat hunched there, so tensely, and they had to pass it if they wanted to regain the path. Colin and Susan moved forward, longing to run, but held by the crow's eye. and as they reached the centre of the dell, the bird gave a loud, sharp croak. Immediately a cry answered from among the rocks, and out of the shadows on either side of the children rose a score of outlandish figures. They stood about 3 feet high, and were man-shaped, with thin, wiry bodies and limbs, and broad, flat feet and hands. Their heads were large, having pointed ears, round, saucer eyes, and gaping mouths which showed teeth. Their hides were generally of a fish-white colour, and hairless. Some held coils of black rope, while out of one of the caves advanced a group carrying a net, woven in the shape of a spider's web. The children raced back along the dell and flung themselves through the gap into the beechwood. Fingers clawed and ropes hissed like snakes, but they were through and plunging down the slope in a flurry of dead leaves. "Stop, Sue!" yelled Colin. He realized that their only hope of escape lay in reaching the path that led from Stormy Point to the road, where their longer legs might outdistance their pursuers. "Stop, Sue! We must not go down any further. Find Stormy Point." They began to flounder up the hill. The creatures scurried across to intercept the children, bending low over the ground as they ran. Slowly, Colin and Susan gained height until the danger of being cut off from the path was no longer with them. Unseen twigs rolled beneath their feet, and leaves dragged about their knees, but at last they pulled themselves onto the path. "Run for it, Sue!" gasped Colin. "They're not far behind." Above their heads a bird cried harshly 3 times, and at once the air was filled with the beating of a gong. The sound seemed to come from a distance, yet it was all about them in the air and under the ground. Then they ran clear of the trees and on to Stormy Point, and were confronted with several hundred of the creatures as they came out of the Devil's Grave. Colin and Susan halted. Gone was their last hope of reaching the road. The way was blocked to front and rear. On their left was the beechwood. To the right, a slope dropped between pines into a valley. So the children turned that way and fled, stumbling and slithering down a sandy path, till at last they landed at the bottom, only to splash knee-deep in the mud and leaf mould of a swamp. "Come on, Sue," said Colin. "Only a few more yards." He had spotted a huge boulder sticking out of the swamp, and if only they could reach it, it would offer some protection. He grabbed his sister's arm and dragged her through the mud to the base of the rock. "Now, climb!" The edge of the swamp was a mass of bodies. The rising moon shone on their leather hides and was reflected in their eyes. Colin could see white shapes spreading out on either side to encircle the rock. He climbed after his sister. When the circle was complete, the creatures began to advance across the swamp, moving easily over the mire on their splayed feet. Ever closer they came, till the rock was surrounded. From all sides at once the ropes came snaking through the air, as soft as silk, as strong as iron, and clung to the children as though coated with glue. So that in no time at all Colin and Susan fell helpless beneath the sticky coils, and above them swarmed the mob, pinching and poking and binding and trussing until the children lay with only their heads exposed. But as they were being hoisted onto bony shoulders, there was a flash, and the whole rock was lapped about by a lake of blue fire. The children could feel no heat, but their captors fell, hissing and spitting into the swamp, and the ropes charred and crumbled into ash. Then from the darkness above a voice rang out. "Since when have men children grown so mighty that you must meet 2 with hundreds? Run, maggot breed of Ymir, ere I lose my patience." The crowd drew back slowly, snarling and blinking in the blue light, wavered and fled. The children listened to the rushing feet. Soon there was only the rattle of stones, then nothing. The cold flames about the rock flickered and died. The moon shone peacefully upon the quiet valley. Standing on a path beneath a cliff some way above them, the children saw an old man, tall and thin. He was clad in a white robe. His hair and beard were white, and in his hand was a white staff. "Come quickly, children, lest there be worse than Svarts abroad. Come, you need not fear me." Colin and Susan climbed down from the rock and squelched their way up to join him.
"Stay close to me. Your troubles are over, though I fear it may be only for this night."
And he touched the cliff with his staff. There was a hollow rumble, and a crack appeared in the rock, through which a slender ray of light shone. The crack widened to reveal a tunnel leading down into the earth. It was lit by a soft light, much the same as that which had scattered the mob in the swamp. The old man led Colin and Susan into the tunnel, and the opening closed behind them, shutting out the night and its fears. The tunnel was quite short, and soon they came to a cave. It was sparsely but comfortably furnished. "Oh!" cried Susan, as she gazed at their surroundings. "This can't be real. We must be dreaming." But Colin was staring at the old man. "Then the legend is true," said Colin.
"It is," said the wizard. "But we must discover what is in you to draw the attentions of the Svat Alpha."
"Oh, please," interrupted Susan. "Can't you tell us first what's been happening and what those things were in the marsh? We don't even know who you are."
The old man smiled.
"I have had many names among many peoples through the long ages of the earth, but you shall call me Cadellin. The creatures you encountered are of the goblin race, the Svat Alpha. They are a cowardly people, night-loving and sun-loathing, much given to throttlings in dark places and seldom venturing above ground. It would have fared ill with you had I not known their alarm echoing through the hollow hill. And now you must tell me what it is that has brought you into such danger this night."
"I don't see that we can have done anything to attract anybody's attention," said Colin.
"This is indeed puzzling," said Cadellin. "The crow was sent to arrange your taking, but why the moth brood should be concerned with you defeats me utterly. Yet I must discover this reason, for my destruction is their aim, and somehow I fear you could advance them in their work. I shall give you what protection I can, and you will find friends as well as enemies in these woods."
"But why are you in danger?" said Susan. "And who are the moth brood?"
That is a long story. Let us go together, and I shall show you part of the answer."
Cadellin led the children out of the cave and down a tunnel into the very heart of the hill. And as they went, the air grew colder, and the strange light fiercer, turning from blue to white, until at last they came into a long, low cavern. An echoing sigh rose and fell upon the air, and before the children's eyes were the sleeping knights in their silver armour, each beside his milk-white mare, just as Gowther had described them in the legend. And all around and over the motionless figures, the cold white flames played silently. In the middle of the cave, on a couch of stone, lay a knight comelier than all his fellows. By his side was placed a naked sword, and on the blade was the image of 2 serpents in gold, and so brightly did the blade gleam that it was as if 2 flames of fire started from the serpents' heads.
"Long years ago," said Cadellin, "Nastrond, the great spirit of darkness, rode forth in war upon the plain. But there came against him a mighty king, and Nastrond fell. He cast off his earth shape and fled into the abyss of Ragnarok. And all men rejoiced, thinking that evil had vanished from the world forever. Yet the king knew that this could never be. So he called together a great assembly of wizards and wise men, and it was prophesied that when the day should come, there would be none pure enough to withstand Nastrond, since by that time he would have put a little of himself into the hearts of all men. Yet the world might still be saved if a band of warriors, pure in heart and brave, could defy Nastrond and compel him to sink once more into the abyss. Their strength would not be in numbers, but in purity and valour. The king chose the worthiest of his knights, and went with them to Fundindelv, the ancient dwarf halls, where they were put into enchanted sleep. The most powerful magicians of the age began to weave a spell, and at the end, Fundindelv was guarded by the strongest magic the world has known, magic that would stay the sleeping warriors from growing old or weak. The heart of the magic was sealed with fire frost, the Weirdstone of Brisingamen, and it became my charge until the time shall come for me to rouse the sleepers and send them forth against Nastrond. Now it happened that at the ceiling of Fundindelv there were not more than 139 pure white mares to be found anywhere. Therefore I was forced to wait for that one horse to complete my company. And when at last such a horse came my way, I little knew that it would be so dearly bought. Word of what we had done at Fundindelv soon reached Nastrond, so he too devised a plan. In the next chamber to that of the sleepers had been stored jewels and precious metals. Although Nastrond had no thought for the treasure, he did desire most furiously to break the spell. For if this were achieved, the sleepers would wake and become normal men. He summoned the witches and warlocks of the Morth Brood, and the lord of the Svart Alfar, and put greed and craving for riches in their hearts by telling them of the treasure that would be theirs if they could only reach it. And from that hour they have striven to find a way to break the spell. This light around us is the magic that guards all here, and its flames are torment to the followers of Nastrond, and the source of the magic, as I have said, rests in the stone Firefrost. While Firefrost remains, and there is light in Fundindelv, the sleepers lie here in safety. Yet each day I dread that I shall see the flames tremble and give way to shadows, and hear the murmur of men roused from sleep and the neigh of horses. For I have lost the Weirdstone of Brisingamen.
"Lost it?" cried Susan. "You can't have done."
Cadellin stopped before a bowl-shaped recess.
"There is the throne of Firefrost," he said, "and you will see that it is now vacant."
They passed through into a cavern similar to the last, and Colin and Susan halted in awe. Here lay the treasure, piled in banks of jewels and gold and silver, which stretched away into the distance like sand dunes in a desert.
"Oh," gasped Susan, "how beautiful! Look at those colours." "You would not think them so beautiful," said Cadellin, "if you had spent 5 years labouring in this cave and scouring every gallery and path in Fundindelv without success. I can only think that the farmer was a greedier and more cunning rogue than he appeared, and that as he followed me from here, laden as he was with wealth, his eyes fell upon the stone, and he took it. Should Firefrost come into Nastrond's hand, my danger would be great indeed. For if he could destroy the stone, then the magic too would die away. Firefrost was an ancient spellstone of great strength, and it would not readily suffer destruction. So, while the light shines here, I know that somewhere the stone still lives, and there is hope. There you have the answer to your questions. Now you must return to your home, for the hour is late and your friends will be anxious, and they may have ample cause for worry if we cannot solve this evening's problem soon." They climbed upwards till the way was blocked by a pair of iron gates, behind which the tunnel ended in a sheer rock wall. The wizard touched the gates with his staff, and slowly they swung open. Cadellin laid his hand upon the wall, and a dark gap appeared in the blue rock, through which the night air flowed, cold and dew-laden. They walked up the path to Stormy Point. All was quiet, just the grey rocks and the moonlight. "Do Svarts live in all the mines?" asked Susan. "They do. You must keep away from the mines now, at all costs.
Cadellin took the children along a broad track that cut straight through the wood as far as the open fields, where it turned sharply along the meadow border skirting the woodland. This, the wizard said, was once an elf road, and some of the old magic still lingered. Svarts would not set foot on it, and the Morth brood would do so only if hard-pressed. He told the children to use this road if they had need to visit him, and not to stray from it, for parts of the wood were evil and dangerous, and on no account must they go out of doors once the sun had set.
"Don't you think it's a bit late to be looking for wizards?"
said Garner, when Colin and Susan reached the farm.
"It's gone 11 o'clock, the nose."
On the crest of the Riddings, staring down upon the farmhouse, was a dark figure, tall and gaunt, and on its shoulder crouched an ugly bird. The next day, when Colin and Susan went down to tea, Garner was already at the table talking to Bess.
"And a couple of rum things happened after dinner, too. I go into the barn, and bless me if the place ain't full of owls, snoozing among the rafters. I've never seen out like it. And then a fellow comes up to me, and he asks if I've a job for him. I didn't like his looks at all. He was a midget, with long black hair and a beard and skin like old leather. Well, when I tell him I dunna need him on, he looks fair put out, and stalks off, saying as I might regret treating him like this. He seemed in a fair out paddy. All the same, I think Scamp had best have the run of the hen pen for a night or two, just in case."
The furious barking of Scamp woke Garner at 3 o'clock. It was the tone used for strangers, high-pitched and continuous. He scrambled into his clothes, seized his shotgun and lantern, and made for the door.
"I knew it! I knew it! The little blighter's after me chickens. I'll give him chickens."
"Watch thy step, lad," said Bess. "You're bigger than he is, and that's all the more of thee for him to hit."
"I'll be all right, but he wunna," said Garner, and he clumped down the stairs and out into the farmyard. Thick clouds hid the moon. There was little wind. The only sounds were the frantic clamour of the dog and the bumping of frightened hens. Garner shone his light into the pen. The wire netting was undamaged, and the gate locked. In the centre of the lamp's beam stood Scamp. His hackles were up, and his ears lay flat against his skull. He was barking and snarling, and tearing at the earth with stiff, jerky movements of his legs. Garner unfastened the gate.
"Where is he, boy? Go fetch him."
Scamp came haltingly out of the pen. Garner was puzzled. He had expected him to come out like a rocket.
"Come on, lad. He'll be gone else."
The dog ran backwards and forwards nervously, still barking. Then he set off towards the field gate in a snarling glide, keeping his belly close to the ground, and disappeared into the darkness. A second later, the snarl rose to a yelp, and he shot back into the light to stand at Garner's feet in a further welter of noise. He was trembling all over.
"What's up, lad? What's for it, eh?"
Garner went towards the gate, his gun cocked, and shone the light into the field. There was nothing wrong as far as he could see, but Scamp, though calmer, still foamed at his heels. Nothing wrong, yet there was something. A cold, clammy air drifted against Garner's face, and with it a smell so strange, so unwholesome and unexpected, that a knot of instinctive fear tightened in his stomach. It was the smell of stagnant water and damp decay. It filled his nostrils and choked his lungs, and for a moment Garner imagined that he was being sucked down into the depths of a black swamp. He swung round, gasping, the hairs of his neck prickling erect. But on the instant, the stench passed and was gone. He breathed pure night air once more.
"By gow, lad, there's summat rum afoot tonight. That was from nowt local, choose how the wind blows. Come on, let's be having a scrat around."
They went into the outhouses, and nowhere was there any hint of disturbance.
"Aye, well, everywhere seems right enough now on a road," said Garner. "It's funny how your imagination plays—"
He stopped dead in his tracks, while Scamp pressed, whining, close to his legs. Out of the blackness, far above Garner's head, had come a single shriek, too harsh for human voice, yet more than animal. For the second time that night, Gowther's blood froze. Then he strode quickly towards the house with Scamp at his heels. In one movement he lifted the latch, stepped across the threshold, closed the door, and shot the bolt home. He turned and looked down at Scamp.
"I dunno know about thee, lad, but I'm going to have a strong cup of tea."
By the time he had made the tea, washed, and finished dressing, it was light outside, and near milking time. The sun was breaking through the cloud. Gowther was halfway across the yard when he noticed the long, black feathers that lay scattered upon the cobblestones. The following day, in Alderley village, Susan went with Bess to the shops, while Colin helped Gowther deliver the vegetables. It was hot, and by 4 o'clock Colin and Susan were very thirsty, so they went to the village cafe for ice creams and lemonade. Susan was toying with her bracelet, and idly trying to catch the light so that she could see the blue heart of her tear. "It's always difficult to find," she said. "I never know when it's going to come right. Wait a minute. Yes, got it. You know, it reminds me of the light in Fundin." She looked at Colin. "But it couldn't be," said Colin. "The wizard would have recognized it as soon as he saw it." "He couldn't have seen it. I was wearing my mackintosh." "We must find Cadellin at once," said Colin. "If this is Firefrost, the sooner he has it, the better it will be for us all." The cart drew up outside, and Gowther called that it was time to be going home. "Bess," said Susan, "are you sure you can't remember anything else about the Brightstone? I want to find out as much as I can about it." "Nay, lass, I've told ye all as I know." "Have you always lived in Alderley?" "Bless ye, yes. I was born and bred in Thuff, but my mother was a gooseberry woman, and I believe before that her family had connections Mobberley way." "Oh?" "Gowther," said Colin, "before we come home, Sue and I want to go to Stormy Point. Which is the nearest way?"
"Your best way'll be to get off at the gamekeeper's lodge and follow the main path till it forks by the old quarry. Then take the left-hand path, and it'll bring you straight to Stormy Point."
They reached the top of the edge, and Gowther halted Prince. Along the side of a cottage, a track disappeared among the trees. The children jumped from the cart and ran off along the track. "Don't you think we'd better go by the path Cadellin told us to use? He said it was the only safe one, remember?" "We haven't time to go all that way round," said Colin. "We must show him your tear as soon as we can. And anyway, Gowther says this is the path to Stormy Point, and it's broad daylight, so I don't see that we can come to any harm." They pressed deeper and deeper into the wood, and came to a level stretch of ground where the bracken thinned and gave place to rich turf, dappled with sunlight. And here, in the midst of so much beauty, they learnt too late that wizards' words are seldom idle. Out of the ground on all sides swirled tongues of thick white mist, which merged into a fog about the children's knees. It paused, gathered itself, and leapt upwards, blotting out the sun and the world of life and light. It was too much for Susan. She ran, stumbled a score of paces, then tripped and fell full length upon the grass. She threw her arms out to protect herself, and realized that there was no earth beneath her fingers, only emptiness. "Sue, where are you?" It was Colin's voice, calling softly. "Are you all right?" "I'm here. Be careful. I think I'm on the edge of a cliff, but I can't see." "Keep still, then. I'll feel my way to you." He crawled in the direction of Susan's voice, and wriggled cautiously alongside her. The turf ended under his nose, and all beyond was a sea of grey. "Oh, good job you tripped, Sue. This must be the old quarry. We must go back to the path. If we don't find it, we may walk round in circles until nightfall, if we're left alone as long as that." "Let's get away from this quarry," said Susan. They stood up, and holding each other's hand, walked slowly back toward the path. Susan grew more and more uneasy. "Colin," she said at last, "I hadn't run more than a dozen steps, I'm sure, when I tripped, and we've been walking for a good 5 minutes. Do you think we're going the right way?" "No, I don't. And I don't know which is the right way, so we'll have to hope for the best. We'll try to walk in a straight line, and perhaps we'll leave this fog behind." But they did not. Either the mist had spread out over a wide area, or, as the children began to suspect, it was moving with them. They made very slow progress. Every few paces they would stop and listen, but there was only the silence of the mist.
"Oh, I wish Cadellin would come," said Susan.
"Let's shout for help. He may hear us."
"All right."
1, 2, 3.
"Cadellin! Help! Cadellin!"
It was like shouting in a padded cell. Their voices, flat and dead, soaked into the grey blanket.
"It's no use," said Susan. "He'll never hear us."
The children made their way in silence, Susan concentrating on the ground immediately in front, Colin alert for any sight or sound of danger. All at once Susan halted.
"What's this?"
At their feet lay 2 rough-hewn boulders, and beyond them, on either side, could be seen the faint outline of others. They passed between the stones, only to stop short a couple of paces later. They were in the middle of a ring of stones, and the surrounding low, dim shapes rose on the limit of vision, as though marking the boundary of the world. Facing the children were 2 stones, far bigger than the rest, and on one of the stones sat a figure. And the jaws of the trap closed about them. The grass within the circle, alive with the magic of the place, writhed about their feet, shackling them in a net of blade and root. Colin and Susan strained to tear themselves free. Slowly the figure rose from its seat and came towards them. Of human shape it was, and covered from head to foot in a loose habit, dank and green. A deep cowl hid the face, skin mittens were on the wasted hands, and the air was laden with the reek of foul waters. The creature stopped in front of Susan and held out a hand. Not a word was spoken.
"No," gasped Susan. "You shan't have it."
And she put her arm behind her back.
"Leave her alone," yelled Colin. "If you touch her, Cadellin will kill you."
The shrouded head turned slowly towards him, and he gazed into the cavern of the hood. Courage melted from him, and his knees were water. Then the figure stretched out its arms and seized both the children by the shoulder. An icy numbness swept down from the grip of those hands into their bodies, and the children stood paralyzed, unable to move. In a moment the bracelet was unfastened from Susan's wrist, and the grim shape strode into the mist. And the mist gathered round it and formed a swirling cloud that moved swiftly away among the trees and was lost to sight. The sun shone upon the stone circle, and upon the figures standing motionless in the centre. The warm rays poured life and feeling into their bodies, and they began to move. Slowly the numbness drained from their limbs, and the grass released its hold.
"Out circle,"
wheezed Colin. They staggered sideways and fell down a small bank onto a path.
"Find Cadellin. I think that may be Stormy Point ahead."
Across the stones they ran, and down to the iron gates, and when they came to the rock they flung themselves against it, beating with their fists and calling the wizard's name, but no gates appeared, no cavern opened. Colin prized a stone out of the ground and began to pound the wall, shouting, "Open up! Open up! Open up! Open up! Open up!"
"Now, that is no way to come a-visiting wizards," said a voice above them.
Colin and Susan looked up. Over the top of the rock dangled a pair of feet, and between these were 2 eyes, black as sloes, set in a leathery face, bearded and bushy-browed.
"Rocks are old, stubborn souls. They have all the time there is, and will not be hurried."
The face disappeared, and from behind the rock stepped a man 4 feet high. He wore a belted tunic of grey, pointed boots, and breeches bound tight with leather thongs. His black hair reached to his shoulders, and on his brow was a circlet of gold.
Are you a dwarf?"
said Susan.
"That
am I?"
He bowed low.
"By name, Fenodiri. Wineskin or Squabnose, to disrespectful friends, take your pick."
"Oh, please," said Susan, "take us to the wizard if you can. Something dreadful has happened."
Fenodiri ran his hands down the rough stone like a man stroking the flanks of a horse. The rock stirred and clove in two, and there were the iron gates and the blue light of Fundindelv.
"Now the gates," said Fenodiri. "My father made them, and so they hear me."
He laid his hands upon the metal, and the gates opened.
"Stay close, lest you lose the way."
Colin and Susan hurried after him. The rock and iron closed behind them, and they were again far from the world of men. Down they went into the edge, and came at last to a cave, and there they found Cadellin.
"The day's greeting to you, Cadellin Silverbrow,"
said Fenodiri.
"And to you, Wineskin. Now, what bad news do you bring me, children?"
"Cadellin," cried Susan, "my tear must be Firefrost, and it's just been stolen."
"What tear is this?"
"My tear, the one my mother gave me. She had it from Bess Mossock."
And out poured the whole story. The wizard grew older before their eyes. He sank down upon his chair, his face lined and grey.
"It is the stone. It is the stone. No other has that heart of fire. And it was by me, and I did not hear it call. Grimnir," he cried, "are you to be my ruin at the end? Quick, we must take him in the open before he gains the lake. I shall slay him if I must."
"Nay, Cadellin," said Fenodiri, "it is near an hour since the hooded one strode swampwards. He will be far from the light by now, and even you dare not follow there."
"What you say is reason. For good or ill, the stone is with him. All we can do is guard and wait."
He looked at the children.
"Colin, Susan, you must in no way blame yourselves for what has happened. The elf road would have been but short refuge from him who came against you this day. Grimnir, the hooded one."
"But what is he?"
said Susan.
"He was a man. Once he studied under the wisest of the wise and became a great law master, but in his lust for knowledge he practiced the forbidden arts, and the black magic made a monster of him. He left the paths of day, and went to live, like Grendel of old, beneath the waters of Llynthi, the Black Lake."
"No one in memory has seen his face or heard his voice,"
added Fenodiri.
"Dwarf legend speaks of a great shame that he bears therein, reminding him of what he is, and of what he might have been. But then, that is only an old tale we learnt at our mother's knee."
"Nor have we time for folk talk," said Cadellin. "Now tell me, who can have seen the stone and recognized it?"
"Well, nobody," said Colin.
"Selina Place," cried Susan. "Selina Place. My tear went all misty. Don't you remember, Colin? She must have seen my tear and stopped to make certain."
"Ah,"
laughed Fenodiri bitterly.
"Old shape-shifter up to her tricks. We might have guessed the weight of the matter had we but known she was behind it."
"Why did you not tell us this when we first met?" the wizard shouted.
"It didn't seem important," said Colin. "I thought she was queer in the head."
"Selina Place, as she is known to you, is the chief witch of the Moth Brood. Worse, she is the Morrigan, the third bane of Logris."
Susan was almost in tears.
"Is there nothing we can do?"
"I think there is little any of us can do now. You must go from here and forget all you have seen and done. Now that the stone is out of your care, you will be safe. You have no further part in this. High magic and low cunning will be the weapons of the fray, and the valor of children would be lost in the struggle. You can help me best by freeing me from worry on your behalf."
He took the children by the hand, and shortly they stood above the swamp on the spot where they had first met the wizard 3 nights ago.
"Must we really not see you again?" said Colin.
"Believe me, It must be so. It hurts me, too, to part from friends, and I can guess what it is to have the door of wonder and enchantment closed to you, when you have glimpsed what lies beyond. But it is also a world of danger and shadows, and ere long, I fear, I must pass into these shadows. Now go. Thenodary will keep with you to the road.
He entered the tunnel. The rock echoed, and he was gone.
"Do not think him curt or cruel,"
said Thenodary.
"He is going now to prepare himself to face death, and worse than death, for the stone's sake. He has said farewell because he knows there may be no more meetings for him this side of Ragnarok."
They walked along a path that curved round a hillside, gradually rising till it ran along the crest of the edge.
"You will be safe now,"
said Thenodary.
"but if you should have need of me, tell the owls in Farmer Mossock's barn. They understand your speech, and will come to me. 2 nights since they brought word that evil things were closing on you. A bird that seemed no true bird brought to the farm a strange presence that filled them with dread. I can guess now that it was the hooded one. And here is Castle Rock, from which we can see his lair."
They had come to a flat outcrop that jutted from the crest.
"It is as I thought,"
said Thenodary.
"The Black Master is in his den. See, yonder is Llyn-ddu."
2 or 3 miles out on the plain, Colin and Susan could see the glint of grey water through trees.
"Ah, but there goes he who can tell us more about the stone."
He pointed to a speck floating high over the plain and whistled shrilly.
"Hi, Windhover, to me!"
The speck paused, then came swooping through the air and landed on Thenodary's outstretched arm, a magnificent kestrel.
"It is of Grimnir that we want news."
The kestrel gave a series of sharp cries.
"Aye, it is as I thought,"
said Thenodary.
"A mist crossed the plain a while since and sank into Llyn-ddu. Farewell now, my friends. Yonder is the road. Remember us, though Cadellin forbade you, and wish us well."
Shortly before Christmas, Colin discovered that the owls had left the barn. "Either Cadellin's got the stone back again," said Colin, "or he's lost the fight. Or perhaps it's only that he's sure we're out of danger." Late one Sunday afternoon, at the end of the first week in January, Colin and Susan climbed out of Alderley village, pushing their bicycles before them. "Look," said Colin. "Look over there." Cadellin stood against the skyline of Castle Rock, staff in hand, facing the plain. The children dropped their bicycles and ran. "Cadellin! Cadellin!"
"Oh, Cadellin, we thought something must have happened to you," cried Susan.
"We were so worried," said Colin. "When the owls disappeared, we wondered if you'd...
"You must not look on life so fearfully," said Cadellin. "We called the birds away because we knew that you were no longer in danger from the moth brood."
"Have they still got my tear?" said Susan.
"Yes and no," said the wizard. "Grimnir has the stone. He should have delivered it to Nastrond, but the moth brood and he intend to master it alone. And here we have wheels within wheels, for Grimnir and Shapeshifter are planning to reap all benefits for themselves and leave the brood and the Svarts to whistle for their measure. I know Grimnir too well to imagine that he would willingly share power with anyone, and the Morrigan, for all her guile, is no match for him. And it may be among all this treachery that we shall find our chance, but for the present we watch and wait. Firefrost is not in Nastrond's hand, and for that we must be thankful. There, you have it all, and now we go our ways once more, for we do not want you to fall foul of that one again."
He pointed with his staff. About the trees through which the black lake could normally be seen hung a blanket of fog. Elsewhere, as far as the eye could see, the sunset plain was free of haze or mist, but Llyn-ddu brooded under a fallen cloud.
"It has been there for over a week," said the wizard,
I think he is trying to seal Firefrost within a circle of magic to prevent its power from reaching Fundindelv. He will not succeed, and he has not the strength to destroy the stone. But then, I have not the power to take it by force, so the matter rests.
The mist was still there the following morning. Colin and Susan had set out on their bicycles to spend the day exploring the countryside. Colin had suggested taking another look at Llyn Ddu. So there they now were, sitting on Castle Rock and gazing at the mist. "I wonder," Colin said, "what it's like close to. Do you think we'd be breaking a promise if we went just to look?" "Well, we're looking now, and we'd be doing the same thing, only from a lot nearer, wouldn't we?" Colin and Susan rode to Alderley, bought a bottle of lemonade to go with their sandwiches, and within 30 minutes they came upon an expanse of damp ground, covered with scrub and heather, and a notice board which stated that this was Lindau Common. And in the middle of the common was a lake of black, peat-stained water. The children stood on the slimy shore. The air was dank, and the scenery depressing. "Do you think this is it?" said Colin. "Lindau? Llyn Ddu? It has to be. And it's a black lake, all right. I wonder what's happened." For if they were indeed at Llyn Ddu, then within the space of an hour it had rid itself of every trace of the mist that had shrouded it for the last 10 days. "Oh, let's go," said Colin. "We've done what we set out to do. Now let's enjoy the rest of the day." The children pedalled back towards Alderley. They had no plans, but the sun was warm, and there were a good 6 hours of daylight left. They were crossing the station bridge at Alderley when they saw it. Halfway up the slope of the edge, a ball of mist hung as though moored to the trees, and out of the mist rose the chimneys and gaunt gables of St. Mary's Cliff, the home of Selina Place. The room was painted black. Round the walls and about the windows were draped black velvet tapestries. The bare wooden floor was stained a deep red. There was a table on which lay a rod, forked at the end, and a silver plate containing a mound of red powder. On one side of the table was a reading stand, which supported an old vellum book of great size, and on the other stood a brazier of glowing coals. Grimnir looked on as Shapeshifter moved through the ritual of preparation. He did not like witch magic. It relied too much on clumsy nature spirits and the slow brewing of hate. He preferred the lightning stroke of fear and the dark powers of the mind. There could be very little time left now before Nastrond acted. But how to master the stone? It had come near to destroying him. The sole chance now lay in this Morth woman's witchcraft, and she must be watched. It would not do for the stone to become her slave. Shapeshifter traced an intricately patterned circle on the floor with black sand. Often she would halt, make a sign in the air with her hand, and mutter to herself. So intent on her work was the Morrigan, and so wrapped in his thoughts was Grimnir, that neither of them saw the 2 pairs of eyes that inched round the side of the window. The circle was complete. Shapeshifter went to the table and picked up the rod. At that moment, a clamour arose on the far side of the house. It was the eerie baying of hounds.
"Ah, you see, they are restless. There is something on the wind. Perhaps it would be wise to let them seek it out. They will soon let us know if it is aught beyond their powers, as well it may be. For if we do not have Ragnarok and Fundindelv upon our heads before the day is out, it will be no thanks to you."
She stumped round the corner of the house. Selina Place was uneasy and out of temper. For all his art, what a fool Grimnir could be, to come so obviously on such an errand. Like his magic, he was no match for the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. It would take the old sorcery to tame that one, and he knew it, for all his fussing in Llyn Ddu.
All right, we're coming, don't tear the door down."
Behind her, 2 shadows moved out of the mist, slid along the wall and through the open door.
"Which way now?"
whispered Susan. They were standing in a hall, and there was a choice of 3 doors leading from it. One of these was ajar, and seemed to be a cloakroom. "In here. Then we'll see which door she goes through." The masculine tread of Selina Place came out of the mist.
"Now, let us do what we can in haste,"
she said, as she rejoined Grimnir.
"We shall not feel safe until we are master of the stone. Give it to us now."
Grimnir unfastened a pouch at his waist, and from it drew Susan's bracelet. Firefrost hung there, its bright depths hidden beneath a milky veil. The Morrigan took the bracelet and placed it in the middle of the circle on the floor. She pulled the curtains over the windows, went to the brazier, took a handful of powder from the silver plate, and sprinkling it over the coals, cried in a loud voice,
"Demoriel, Carnefiel, Caspiel, Amenadiel."
A flame hissed upwards, filling the room with ruby light. Shapeshifter opened the book and began to read.
"Vos omnes it ministri odi et destructiones et seratores discorde."
"What's she up to?" said Susan. "I don't know, but it's giving me goose flesh."
"Eo quod est noce vos conjurase ideo vos coniro et deprecur."
Shadows began to gather about the folds of velvet tapestries. Colin and Susan would have crept away and tried to find Cadellin, had not a dreadful sound of snuffling beneath the cloakroom window made them unwilling to open the outer door. And all the while Shapeshifter's chant droned on, rising at intervals to harsh cries of command.
"Come, Orabas! Come, Orabas! Come, Orabas!"
The children heard the clatter of hoofs upon bare boards, and a wild neighing rang high in the roof.
"Come, Nambroth! Come, Nambroth! Come, Nambroth!"
A wind gripped the house by the eaves and tried to pluck it from its sandstone roots. Something rushed by. The lost voices of the air called to each other in the empty rooms, and the mist clung fast and did not stir.
"Conjuro et confirmo super vos potentis in nome fortis metwendissimi infandi."
After minutes of brooding quiet, a door opened, and the voice of Selina Place came to the children from outside the cloakroom.
"And we say the stone will be safe. Nothing can reach it from outside. Come away. This is a dangerous brew, should it boil over, and we, near that, would be the end of us. Hurry. The force is growing. It is not safe to watch."
Grimnir joined her, and they went together through the doorway on the opposite side of the hall, and their footsteps died away. "Well, how do we get out of this mess?" said Colin. "It looks as though we're stuck here until she calls these animals off."
"Colin, we can't go yet. My Tier's in that room, and we'll never have another chance."
"But, Sue, didn't you hear Old Place say that it wasn't safe to be in there? And if she's afraid to stay, it must be dangerous."
"I don't care. I've got to try. Are you coming?"
They stepped out of the cloakroom and cautiously opened the left-hand door.
"All clear,"
whispered Susan. A black pillar in the centre of the floor climbed from the circle that Selina Place had made, a column of oily smoke. And in the smoke, strange shapes moved. Their forms were indistinct, but the children could see enough to wish themselves elsewhere. As they watched, the climax came. Faster and faster the pillar whirled, and thicker the dense fumes grew, and the floor began to tremble, and the children's heads were full of mournful voices that reached them out of a great and terrible distance.
Flecks of shadow, buzzing like flies, danced out of the tapestries and were sucked into the reeking spiral. Then, without warning, the base of the column turned blue. The buzzing rose to a demented whine. The whole swirling mass shuddered, lost momentum, and died. Silver lightnings ran upwards through the smoke, and the column collapsed into the ball of fire that rose to engulf it. A voice whimpered close by the children and passed through the doorway behind them. The blue light waned, and in its place lay Firefrost, surrounded by the scattered remnants of Shapeshifter's magic circle. Slowly, Susan moved forward, picked up her bracelet, and fastened it about her wrist. In a small room crammed under the eaves, Selina Place and Grimnir waited. They knew well the price of failure.
"It cannot be long now,"
said the Morrigan. A trail of smoke drifted under the door and floated across the room, and a bubbling sound of tears accompanied it. The Morrigan jumped from her chair. Her eyes were wild, and there was sweat on her brow. The smoke curled round her towards the hearth and leapt into the chimney mouth. A wind sighed past the windows and was still.
"No, no,"
she mumbled. Grimnir was halfway down the first flight of stairs when there was a sound of breaking glass, and the staircase was momentarily in shadow, as a dark figure blocked the window at its head. The Morrigan's harsh voice cried out in fear. "Here, let's get out of this," said Colin. "As soon as we're outside, run like mad." Colin opened the door. There was a rasping growl, and out of the mist came a shape that sent the children stumbling backwards into the house, and before they could close the door, the hound of the Morrigan crossed the threshold. It was like a bull terrier, except that it stood 4 feet high at the shoulder, and its ears, unlike the rest of the white body, were covered with coarse red hair. From pointed ears to curling lip, its head and muzzle were blank. There were no eyes. The beast paused, swinging its wedge-shaped head from side to side, snuffling, and when it caught the children's scent it moved towards them as surely as if it had eyes. Colin and Susan dived for the nearest door, into a kitchen, which had nothing to offer them but another door. "We'll have to risk it," said Susan. "That thing'll be through in a second." The latch was rattling beneath the scrabbling of claws. But as she spoke they heard another sound, footsteps rapidly drawing near to the other door, and then the latch gave way, and the hound was in the room. Colin seized a kitchen chair. "Get behind me!" At the sound of his voice it froze, but only for an instant. "Can we reach a window?" Colin dared not take his eyes off the hound as it advanced upon them. "No." "Is there another way out?" "No." He was parrying the lunges and snappings with the chair, but it was heavy and his arms ached. "There's a broom cupboard or something behind us, and the door's ajar." "What good will that do?" "I don't know, but Grimnir may not notice us, or the dog may attack him." "Right, get in." Susan stepped inside and held the door open for Colin as he backed towards it. The hound was biting at the chair legs and trying to paw them down. Wood crunched and splinters flew. Colin hurled the chair at the snarling head and fell backwards into the cupboard. Susan had a vision of a red tongue lolling out of a gaping mouth and of fangs flashing white, inches from her face, before she slammed the door, and at the same moment she heard the kitchen door being flung open. Her stomach turned over, her head reeled, and she seemed to be falling into the bottomless dark. Colin bumped against her in struggling to right himself, and the back of the cupboard was pressing into her. Colin and Susan stood rigidly side by side, nerving themselves for the moment when the door would be opened, but the room seemed unnaturally still. "It's too quiet out there," whispered Colin. "Shh! I can't see a keyhole anywhere. There should be one somewhere." He bent forward to feel. "Ouch! It feels like smooth rock going past very quickly, and I've skinned my hand on it. That's why my ears have been popping. We're in a lift." The floor seemed to press against their feet. "Where on earth are we?" said Colin. "It's probably more like where in earth are we?" Susan knelt on the floor of the cupboard and reached down and touched wet rock. "Well, there's a floor. Let's have our bike lamps out and see what sort of place this is." By the light of the lamps they saw that they were at the mouth of a tunnel that stretched away into the darkness.
Now what do we do? We can't go back, even if we wanted to. Come on. They shouldered their packs and started off along the tunnel, but seconds later a slight noise brought them whirling round. "That's torn it," said Colin, gazing up at the shaft, into which the cupboard was disappearing. "They'll be on to us in no time now." The children went as fast as they could, stumbling over the uneven floor and bruising themselves against the walls. The air was musty, and within a minute they were gasping as though they had run a mile, but on they sped, with two thoughts in their head: to escape from whatever was following them, and to find Cadellin or Fenodiri. The passage twisted bewilderingly, and ended in a shaft that dropped beyond the range of their light, and hanging from a spike driven into the rock was a rope ladder. It was wet, and covered with patches of white mould. The rope was slippery. Colin tried not to think of what might happen if Grimnir reached the top of the ladder while they were still on it.
"I'm at the bottom,"
called Susan.
"and it's wet."
The end of the ladder dangled a few inches above an island of sand that lay at the foot of the shaft, and from here 4 ways led off. 2 were silted up, and 2 were flooded. Then Colin saw the end of the ladder begin to dance about in the air. Someone had started to descend. The brown water splashed roof-high as Colin and Susan took to their heels, skidding over unseen rocks. But the tunnel sloped upwards, and they left the water behind and were running on dry sand. The lamp's beam outlined the end of the tunnel against a blackness beyond. The children looked about them. In shape and size, it was just such another cave as the cave of the sleepers in Fundindelv. But instead of the light, darkness pressed in from every side. The yellow walls were streaked with browns, blacks, reds, blues, and greens. Colin bent down and listened at the tunnel mouth. "I can't hear anything," he said, "but we'd better move on." Losing their pursuer was an easy task. It seemed that they were in an intricate system of caverns, connected by innumerable tunnels and shafts. These caverns were remarkable. The walls curved upwards to form roofs high as a cathedral, and the distance between the walls was often so great that at the centre of a cave the children could imagine themselves to be trudging along a sandy beach on a windless and starless night. Tunnels entered and left the caves at all angles and levels. They would run into a cave at any point between roof and floor, and wind out onto dizzy ledges, which in turn dwindled to nothing at all. And the square-mouthed shafts were a continual hazard. It was no place for panic. Every corner, every bend, every opening had to be approached with the greatest caution, for fear of an unwanted meeting. And the caves were the worst of all, for their puny light only accentuated their insignificance, and the feeling of being exposed to unseen eyes grew ever stronger. Somewhere within this labyrinth someone was hunting them down, and Colin and Susan were never more aware of this than when they broke cover beneath a soaring dome of rock and ran through the nightmare sand. At last they could go no further, and, chancing upon a tunnel with a partially blocked entrance, they wriggled inside and lay stretched on the floor. They were consumed by heat and thirst, and fumbled impatiently in Colin's pack for the lemonade. "Better save some for later," said Colin. The children talked in whispers, but first they switched off their lamps. There was no point in adding to their troubles by hastening the moment when the batteries would be exhausted. "Listen," said Colin, "we have to find a way out of here. I think we must be in the copper mines, and if that's so, then there are several ways out. But how do we find them?" "Nearly all the entrances are on top of the edge," said Susan. "If we follow only the tunnels that lead upwards, we're bound to be moving in the right direction, aren't we? I know it's not much of an idea, but it's better than wandering about until Grimnir and Selina find us." "It's not only those two I'm worried about," said Colin. "Have you noticed how the sand is churned up everywhere? These mines aren't as empty as they look. Remember what Cadellin said about avoiding them at all costs because of the Svarts?" It took courage to switch on their lamps and leave their safe retreat for the perils of the open tunnel. No way led upwards for long. Sooner or later the floor would level and begin to drop, and after an hour Colin and Susan had no idea of their whereabouts. Then, imperceptibly, They began to feel that they were gaining ground. This tunnel was different. It was longer than most, and less tortuous.
"Colin, this time I think we're on the right track,"
said Susan, who was in the lead. "I think perhaps we are."
"Oh!"
"What's the matter?" Colin peered over his sister's shoulder. The widest shaft they had yet come upon lay before them, and stretched across its gaping mouth was a narrow plank. This was wet, and partly rotten, and no more than 3 inches rested on the lip of the shaft at either end.
"We'll have to go back," said Colin. "No, we must cross. The tunnel leads somewhere, or the plank wouldn't be here."
And Susan stepped onto the plank. Colin watched his sister walk over the pit. She was 2/3 of the way across when the plank tilted sideways. Colin felt the sweat cold on his spine, but Susan merely paused to correct her balance, and then she was across.
"There, it's easy. A bit rocky near the middle, but it's quite safe. Walk normally and don't look down."
Colin started out. It was not too bad. The plank was firm, and he was prepared for a slight movement just over halfway. But even so, when it came, it caught him unawares. He felt the plank shift. He teetered sideways, his arms flailing. The plank seemed to swing away from him. The lamplight whirled in an arch. He saw that his next step would miss the plank. The shaft yawned beneath him, and he leapt for his life. Colin pulled himself into a sitting position. He felt sick. Colin shone his lamp along the tunnel and groaned. The floor plunged down, and, for as far as they could see, there was no change in its course.
"Down, down, always down," cried Susan bitterly. "Are we never going to see daylight again?"
"Let's carry on, now that we're here," said Colin. "You never know. This may be the way out." He did not want to face the plank again. The passage dropped at an alarming rate. Down, down, down. Further than they had ever been before. And then the tunnel came to an end on a ledge overlooking a great void. Well, we tried. 7 or 8 feet below was a lake of chocolate-coloured water, capped with scuds of yellow foam. "Oh, let's get back to the plank," said Colin. Colin willed himself forward. His ears sang, his legs were rubber, his breath hissed through his teeth, his heart pounded, there was rock under him. Nothing to it. He shone the light on the plank for Susan to cross.
"Yes, it is easier. It slopes up, coming this way."
Susan was in the middle now.
"I wonder how deep the shaft is."
She stopped. "No, Sue, don't look down. It'll make you giddy. Come across. Don't stop."
"I'm all right. I want to see how far down it goes."
And she turned the beam of her lamp into the shaft. She saw the wet rock, ribbed and gleaming, fall away beneath her and vanish into darkness far below. And Susan screamed. The lamp dropped from her hand and crashed from wall to wall into the shaft's throat. It was a terrible depth. She swayed and fell forward, clutching the plank so violently that it began to quiver and grate against its anchorage. Susan knelt, staring into the hole and whimpering with fear.
"Sue! Sue! Get up! What's the matter? Sue!" "Eyes! Eyes looking at me! Down there in the darkness!"
The plank was trembling, and one corner was almost off the rock. "Sue, crawl! Don't look down! Come on! It's only a few feet!"
"I can't! I'll fall!"
"No, you won't! Here, look at me! Don't look at the shaft! Come on, Sue!"
"I can't! I'll fall!"
The plank shifted. "Sue, look up! Look up! That's better. Now, keep looking at me and crawl." Susan started to edge her way towards Colin. Immediately the plank began to tremble more than ever.
"I can't do it! Honestly, I can't!"
"All right, Sue. Stay there. I'm coming." Colin walked out along the plank to join her. "There now, give me your hand. Do you think you can stand up?" He bent down, trying to look no further than his sister's face. Susan grabbed at the hand and flung her other arm around his knees. The plank rocked furiously. Colin fought for balance. Slowly, Susan pulled herself up, clutching her brother all the time until she stood, trembling with her arms on his shoulders. "Now walk. I'll tell you when. With me, now. 1, 2. Colin moved backwards along the plank, feeling behind him for every step.
"I don't know what came over me," said Susan. "I wasn't afraid to begin with.
Something was pulling me on all the time. I was so certain that we were right that crossing the plank was easy. I just knew it would be safe, and I wasn't dizzy. But when I saw those eyes glowing in the shaft, something went wrong in my head. The plank wasn't safe and wide. It was old and rotten and narrow, and the shaft was trying to swallow me, and those eyes were waiting. But how do you know they were eyes? It could have been the light glinting on broken glass. They blinked and moved about. I've never been so frightened before, not even when Grimnir caught us. But I'm not frightened now. It's as though there was a special kind of fear reaching out of the shaft and trying to make me fall. Do you think there were Svarts down there? I don't know. But whatever they were, I think we'd better move from here. Their rest periods became more frequent, and Colin made a rule of switching off the light at such times. The battery was not new, and without light there would be no hope. "I'd like something to eat next time we stop," said Susan. "All right, but we must go very carefully with the food and drink." Colin was very worried about the light. "Ah, here's a likely place," he said. They crawled inside and looked around. It was very suitable, quite a snug little den, until they realized that it was the same tunnel in which they had first rested. All that distance, and to no purpose. "And I was beginning to think we were gaining height," said Colin. They unwrapped the food. "Here you are," said Colin. "Make the most of it."
"You know, perhaps we have climbed a bit," said Susan. "This tunnel may be near the surface."
"Huh," said Colin, out of the darkness. Susan gave a little cough and a gasp. "What's the matter? Got a crumb in your throat? I suppose it means you'll have to have a drink now. Why can't you be more careful?" Colin reached for the lamp and pressed the switch. He was alone. Sue? He scrambled round in the tunnel. It was empty. "Sue?" She had gone. Colin squirmed through the entrance and flashed his lamp up and down. There was nothing to be seen. He ran unthinkingly. Tunnels, caverns, tunnels, an endless desolation of sand and rock. "Sue! Sue!" And at once he was past running. The sand dragged his steps. He tripped and fell. "Sue!" No, that's not the way. Keep quiet. Must think. Put the light out. Must find her. Must find Sue. Rest a minute, though. Just a minute. Slowly, strength returned to his limbs. Colin humped himself onto his elbows and turned on the lamp. Svarts. 2 of them. They were creeping over the sand and were caught full in the beam of light. They reeled back, their eyes blinded by the lamp. They croaked and hissed and blundered along the cave wall. At length they stumbled upon a tunnel and were gone. A muffled cry sounded along the tunnel, and next the scrabble of feet. A Svart burst out of the opening, swerved away from the lamp and fled across the cave. Hard on his heels was the other Svart. Something flashed white in the air. The Svart shrieked and crashed on his face in the sand. A broad, 2-handed sword had pierced him through. Then the Svart faded and crumbled, and all that was left was a haze of dust which settled gently to the floor.
"Oh, Dernwyn, they like not your bite."
The deep voice boomed out of the tunnel, and into the cave strode a dwarf. A Viking in miniature. Yellow hair rolled down his shoulders, his forked beard reached to his waist. About his shoulders hung a cloak of white eagle feathers.
"Breath of Needhug," he bellowed,
shielding his eyes against the light.
"Have I come to this place of unclean air to be half-blinded?"
I'm sorry," stammered Colin, switching the lamp from the dwarf's face.
"You would have been sorrier ere long if I had not found you."
He took up the sword.
"And now come quickly. More Svart heads must roll soon, and I would share them with my cousin."
"But who are you?"
"Durathror, son of Gondabar, am I, prince of the Huldra folk, and friend of the Leosalfa. We have not time for gossip. Come."
The sword clashed in its sheath, and the dwarf entered the tunnel. "Wait!" cried Colin. "I've got to find my sister. She's vanished, and I think the Svarts have taken her.
She is safe, never fear. Now will you come, or must I needs carry you?"
Colin had the greatest difficulty in keeping up with the dwarf, for he set off at a run. But they had not far to go. Rounding a corner, Durathor slowed to a walk, and there, in a cave, were Susan and Fenodiri.
"Sue, I thought I'd never see you again." "Oh, Colin, thank goodness you're safe," cried Susan. "If it hadn't been for Fenodiri and Durathor, I don't know what would have happened."
"I do," said Fenodiri, "and I say it is well we came up with you when we did."
"Came up with us?" said Colin.
"It wasn't Grimnir or Selina Place following us," said Susan. "It was these two."
"Aye," said Fenodiri, "and a fine chase we had of it. But let us go. The way to the light is not long, and we shall tell all our tales in Fundindelv within the hour."
As they hurried along, Colin managed to find out from Susan all that had happened. 2 Svarts had seized her from behind and had carried her off. She had heard Colin's shouts die away. There was a loud cry, and the Svarts dropped her and ran. "But I don't know how they managed to do all this in the dark."
"How can an eagle fly? How can a fish swim?"
laughed Fenodiri. "Yes, but how did you find me so quickly?" said Colin.
"I had but to put my ear to the ground, and your bellowing all but split my head," said Durathor. "The wonder of it is that I found no more than 2 of the Svart Alfar in your company."
"We must go carefully now," said Fenodiri. "Svarts are moving."
The tunnel opened into a broad gallery. Before them rose an outcrop of rock, and it was the shape of a lion's head. Above the head the gallery stretched to a great height, cutting through other levels and caves as it went.
"This is the cave of the Svartmut, and no place for us at any time."
A sound came to them from far away. Colin and Susan had heard it once before. It was the gong that had brought the Svart Alfar out of the Devil's Grave on Stormy Point.
"Ah!"
cried Durathor, and the sword Dernwyn sang aloud as she sprang from her sheath in an arc of light.
"Not now," said Fenodiri. "It would be a good fight, but we should go under, and the stone with us. We must pass unseen."
"By the cow of Orgelmir," growled Durathor, "yours is sour counsel."
"That is the call to Svartmut," said Fenodiri. "We must hurry."
They climbed up a wall to a narrow ledge that curved round to a gallery. The sound of many feet could now be heard drawing nearer. Every tunnel murmured. Fenodiri made for a passage that wound into the roof.
"Quickly now! They are coming by this way, and we must reach hiding before they meet us."
The tunnel wall ended, and they were upon a wide platform. Far beneath lay the cave. At the back of the ledge was a recess.
"In here, and show no light."
Colin switched off the lamp. They were none too soon, for barely had they settled themselves when the Svarts were upon them. They swept by the opening. Colin and Susan listened to the slap of feet and the hiss of breath, and then the unseen crowd was past, and the noise of rustling, croaking, piping, and pulling grew steadily louder as Svarts poured into the cave from every direction, and the air grew rank with their presence. As though at a given signal, the hubbub died, and a tense quiet fell upon the assembled multitude. The Svartmut had begun. Below them a voice began to speak in harsh, high tones. The speaker was working himself into a state of excitement, and the crowd was carried with him.
"They are cowards," said Fenodiri, "and must be driven to frenzy to meet our swords. I guessed it would be so. They are powerless before sudden light, therefore they are to prepare themselves with fire-drake blood. And here is the keeper."
The voices diminished to a murmur. Then the cave was hushed.
"Down,"
whispered Fenodary.
"He is taking off the cover."
A sheet of fire sprang upwards past the ledge and boiled against the roof.
"Ee-yow!"
roared the Svarts. The flames sank and lit the cave with a red glare. A similar light had burned in St. Mary's Cliff earlier that day.
"You may look now,"
said Fenodary. The floor and walls of the cave were covered with Svarts. On top of the Lion's Head rock stood 2 Svarts, one black and the other white, and they were man-size.
"There you see Arthog and Slinkveel, lords of the Svart Alfar," said Fenodary. "See now the fire drake. The eyes of Svarts can look on it without pain, and it makes them strong to face the purer light of day. Henceforth your lamp will be no weapon."
The flame was rising out of a stone cup.
"It is time we were gone,"
said Fenodary. He hurried them along at a relentless pace, and he seemed despondent. Durathro, on the other hand, began to laugh to himself.
"Did I not say the journey would be merry? So we are to be met at the plank shaft, and if all else fails, they wait for us at the gate. Let us hurry to the gate, cousin Squabnose, for I would have these rat-eaters remember the gate in after-time. What few there will be to sing of it when we have passed."
Fenodary sighed and shook his head.
"You forget our charge, old limb-hewer. Firefrost is more to us than life or death in glory. The gate is not for us."
"Not for us? Then how, pray, shall we gain the upper world? There is no other road."
"There is. Just one, and in its fashion it bears more perils than the gate. At least, if we should perish on this road, Firefrost will lie hidden, for we are going where no Svart will ever tread, and only I, in all the world, can tell the way."
Ahead of them a light flickered on the wall.
"What say you now, cousin?"
whispered Durathro eagerly.
"Do we run?"
"We are too near."
"Good. Let the men-children stand here. Go you forward to yonder opening and stay hidden with drawn sword till I call. I shall wait behind this boulder. Hold your ground, stone maiden, be not afraid. No Svart will touch you, that I can promise."
And he melted into the dark. The light grew stronger and cast shadows on the wall, spindly shadows with broad heads and hands, and round the bend came the Svarts. There were 10 of them. Each carried a torch of wood that had been dipped in the flame of the fire drake's blood. From a girdle round each of their waists hung a crude axe. The Svarts halted. A deep sigh ran through them, and slowly they began to advance. The last of them was past Fenodary. They held the torches high, and the other hand was poised to clutch. The children retreated a step. The Svarts rushed forward, but at that moment Durathro stepped from behind the boulder, his sword Dernwyn in his hand.
"Hail, O eaters of toadstools! We are well met!"
The Svarts fell back, hissing, but those to the rear of the pack had more courage.
"See!"
they cried.
"There is the maid who tricked us, and see, she has the stone once more. The stone, the stone, the stone. Seize them, we shall take the stone to ourselves."
"Oh," cried Durathro, "so there is courage in Svart Alfarheim. Come, let my sword test the metal of your new-grown backbones."
We come, we come!"
And they hurled themselves upon the dwarf.
"Gondomar!"
bellowed Durathro, and he whirled Dernwyn above his head with both hands. 2 Svarts died under that stroke. They buckled at the knees and crumbled into dust.
"Gondomar!"
Sparks flew as iron rang on stone, but there were now 6 Svarts in the tunnel, and 4 torches guttering on the sand. 6 to 1. Far too few for battle. The Svarts turned and ran.
"Cousin, it would seem Dernwyn is too bitter for their taste. Let them then savour Widowmaker."
Fenodary came from hiding, and the Svarts halted in dismay.
"It is the White One's dog."
Fenodary did not feel Durathro's joy of battle. These creatures stood between him and his purpose, and must be killed. That was all. The uproar grew less and less. Soon the 2 dwarfs stood gazing at each other across a litter of torches and stone hammers.
"I see Widowmaker is well named," Durathro chuckled.
"Dorathro," said Susan, as they journeyed on, "where do the Svarts go when they disappear?"
"To dust, my stone maiden, to dust. They cannot endure the bite of iron. It has a virtue that dissolves their flesh, and would all creatures of Nastrond were as they."
"Here is the first of our trials," said Fenodary. "But it is naught that a cool head will not overcome."
Before them the tunnel ended in a drop. They were in the roof of a cave, and across the emptiness another tunnel lay. A broken ledge no more than a few inches wide and sloping outwards ran to it along the overhanging wall.
"There are handholds," said Fenodary. "Give me your light, so that you have both hands free."
It looked so easy as they watched him go crabwise across the wall. He moved smoothly and surely, and in a matter of seconds he was there.
"Susan, now, please, I shall light you."
It was easier than Susan expected. She stretched out for the next hold and was transferring her weight when something smashed into the wall close by her head and splinters of rock seared her cheek. Colin had seen the stone axe spin in the lamplight and crash against the rock, and at the same time he had heard behind him a sword being drawn.
"Cross as quickly as you may," said Dorathro. "Stay not for me. I go to teach this troll spawn manners."
And Dorathro threw himself off the ledge into empty space. As he dropped beyond the light, his cloak seemed to fold about him. Colin had just gained the safety of the tunnel mouth when he heard Dorathro's voice right behind him.
3 skulked below. They died swiftly.
"But how did you do it?" cried Colin. "I saw you jump off the ledge. Weren't you hurt?" Dorathro threw back his head and laughed. They started along the tunnel. Fenodary walked very slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was grave.
"Listen to me now. We are about to leave Westmine. Were we to stay, we should certainly die, and the Weirdstone of Brisingamen would be lost. We may still die. Fear is in me greater than I have ever known. We are to pass through the upper galleries of the Earl Delving to where they touch upon another mine. The paths were never wide or high, and the earth has stirred many times in her sleep since they were dug. The road may no longer be as I was taught, and we may lose ourselves forever. But it is our only chance, and we must take it. And here is the threshold."
They were at the corner of yet another cave. At the dwarf's feet lay a shaft, a sloping chimney of stone.
"We must go down there," whispered Susan.
"And before our courage fails. Colin, Susan, follow me. Step where I step. Do not hurry. So we shall come safe to the end."
Fenodary began to climb down the first pitch of the shaft, jamming himself into the angle between the two rock faces. Loose stones rattled down before him, and only the biggest sounded the end of their fall.
"There is room for you both here," he called from the bend. "Come singly. Colin first."
At the foot of the gully, 3 sides of the shaft opened out like the shoulder of a bottle, leaving the remaining side, the all but sheer rock face, within reach.
"We can't go down there," said Colin, aghast. "It's as smooth as ice."
"The eyes of men were ever blind," said Fenodary. "Can you not see the crevices and the ledges?"
The children peered down the shaft, but still it seemed to them impassable.
"Ah, well, you must put your trust in me, that is all. Colin, you are well lodged, so your sister will go first."
Colin handed him the lamp, and Fenodary climbed down to his first station, from which he guided Susan onto the rock face. As soon as she was immediately above him, he descended a little further, and soon Colin was left alone. The patch of light contracted until it appeared to be no bigger than a matchbox, and Colin was wondering how deep the shaft could possibly be, when the light was extinguished. He presumed that Susan was at the bottom, and that Fenodary was on his way up. Colin had not long to wait before the lamp flashed on just below where he was sitting.
"Dorathro," said Fenodary, "when we are below, I shall call. What of the Svarts?"
"They went by another road. More follow."
Soon Colin was standing beside Susan. Fenodary cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted,
"Dorathro!"
An answering voice echoed in the shaft.
"We shall rest here," said Fenodary, "but we must not stay long, for if we do not win clear of the Earl Delving by sunset, we shall have no choice but to stay there until the dawn. and that would be grim indeed.
Dorathor leapt down to join the children and Fenodiri. His cloak whirled about him, and he landed lightly on his feet. The foot of the shaft opened into a small chamber. Colin and Susan divided the remains of the food and drink between them, and, as they ate, the dwarfs pieced together the events that had brought them so unexpectedly to hand in time to rescue Susan. This was their story. Dorathor and Fenodiri were near Castle Rock when the kestrel Windhover brought news that Grimnir had risen from the lake and had entered St. Mary's Cliff. The dwarfs knew that where Grimnir was, there would be Firefrost, and that this may be their chance. Cadellin was prowling in the hills towards Ragnarok to find out if word of the stone had spread, so the dwarfs decided to attack alone. They heard of the children's arrival from Windhover. Grimnir and the Morrigan, said Windhover, were in an upper room. There was unpleasantness behind curtains downstairs. The hounds were loose. Then Dorathor went with the kestrel to the room under the eaves. It was as Colin and Susan had begun to suspect. He had the power of flight. It lay in his cloak of eagle feathers. On finding the curtained room empty, Fenodiri was perplexed, but he had no time to search further, for as he was about to try the kitchen door it was thrown open, and Dorathor cannoned into him.
I could not kill the moth-doers, since their magic is greater than my sword, but they will feel her smarts for many a day.
Dorathor chuckled.
I had seen two things to make me pause. There was a cupboard against the wall, and a hound of the Morrigan made clamour against it, but the door was closed, and I had seen what closed it. A small white hand and firefrost shone upon the wrist. I slew the beast, the rest you know, and it was but luck that brought us to you when we were beyond hope.
If only we'd known, cried Susan.
Aye,
said Fenodiri.
If only. We should have been in Fundendelve ere now.
The children told their story, and when they described the crossing of the plank, the dwarfs grew excited.
Hair of the moondog, shouted Dorathor. And did you not go on?
Oh, yes, said Colin, but the tunnel finished on a platform over a lake.
Had you but known it,
said Fenodiri sadly,
the water is little more than a foot deep, and the way from there leads to the gate, not half a mile distant. Come, must move now.
Colin switched on the light. There was no obvious way out of the chamber. 2 tunnels led off in opposite directions, but they were flooded, and the roofs dropped steadily to meet the green-tinged water. Fenodiri, how do we get out of here? Fenodiri nodded towards the smaller of the tunnels.
Did I not say the road was hard? Colin, is the wrapping for your food proof against water?
Yes, I think so.
Then, when we start, cover the light with it. You will have to trust to my eyes alone for a time.
And may I have your covering for Valham, my cloak?
Said Dorathor to Susan. He unbuckled his feathered cloak and rolled it tightly to fit into the sandwich bag, and Susan fastened it in her pack.
Put out the light,
said Fenodiri,
and have courage.
The water was so cold that it took their breath away. Fenodiri told the others to wait while he went ahead. He drew a deep breath. There was a flurry and a splash.
Where has he gone?
asked Susan.
The roof and water meet where he left us, said Dorathor.
2 minutes passed before Fenodiri broke the surface again.
It is no distance, he said, and the air is fresh, but the roof is low for many yards, so we must swim on our backs.
Another swirl, and he was gone.
I'll wait about a minute,
said Susan. She was more frightened than she cared to admit.
Right, here goes.
She has great courage, said Dorathor. She hides her fear better than any of us.
Are you scared too? Said Colin.
Mortally. I will pit my wits and sword against all odds and take joy in it. But that is not courage. Courage is fear mastered, and in battle I am not afraid.
Well, I'd better be on my way, said Colin.
Good luck to you, said Dorathor.
Colin held his dive as long as possible, but the icy water constricted his lungs, and he soon was in need of air. He rose to what he implored would be the surface, but the back of his head scraped against the roof. What was wrong? Why was there no air? Fenodiri had said... he remembered. Swim on your back. The roof is low. That's it. Colin turned frantically onto his back, and then his lips broke surface. The roof was certainly low. In order to keep his lips above water, he had to squash his nose against the rough stone of the ceiling. Before long, Colin was relieved to find that the distance between surface and roof was increasing. Almost at once the water grew shallow, and then he was knee-deep in mud, and Fenoderi's arm was about him. Dorathro joined them.
"Squabnose," he gasped. "I have been near death many times, but never has he stretched out his hands so close or looked more terrible."
Colin unwrapped the lamp, and by its light the children saw that ahead of them was a tunnel. The roof ran square to the walls, and nowhere was more than a yard high. The going was difficult. The tunnels never ran straight, and they would branch 5 times in as many yards. Caves were few, and water was everywhere. After half a mile the relatively open passages were left behind, and now even the dwarfs were forced to crawl all the time. Roof falls became frequent. Fenoderi called a halt in a cave into which they fitted like segments of an orange.
"We have put the greatest distance behind us," said Fenoderi, "but it is from here that our chief dangers lie. Between Dorathro's feet is the passage that will take us to the light."
"What?" cried Susan. "But that's only a rabbit hole."
"Do not despair. We are not the first to come this way. My father travelled the Earl delving 7 times, and he was an ample dwarf by our reckoning. Now, take note of what I say, for this is the last chance of speech until we come to safety, and there will be no room for error."
Under Fenoderi's instructions, Colin and Susan took off their knapsacks and fastened them by the strap to one ankle. He bade Dorathro take off his sword.
"Keep her ever before you," he said, "and so neither Dernwyn nor the son of Gundamar will be lost."
And he unbuckled his own sword and pushed it into the opening. Both the children had the greatest difficulty in entering the tunnel. Sand choked the entrance, and the tunnel was so heavily silted that it was almost beyond the children to move at all. They lay full length, wall, floor, and roof fitting them like a second skin. Their heads were turned to one side, for in any other position the roof pressed their mouths into the sand and they couldn't breathe. The only way to advance was to pull with the fingertips and to push with the toes. They became unbearably hot. Sand lodged in every fold of skin and worked into mouth, nose, and ears. Ahead, Fenoderi had reached a spot where the tunnel bent abruptly under upon itself like a hairpin, and teasing Widowmaker's rigid blade through the angle was no simple task. Susan felt the obstacle with dismay. It was not possible. But Fenoderi must have found a way round, so she tucked in her head and jackknifed round into the lower level. It was unpleasant, especially when her heels scraped the roof, but her weight carried her down, and it was soon over. Colin was an inch taller than his sister, and that was disastrous. His heels jammed against the roof. He could move neither up nor down, and the rock lip dug into his shins until he cried out with pain. But he could not move. Dorathro, coming up behind, took in the situation at once.
"Try to turn to your side, then to your stomach. I shall guide your feet."
Colin screwed himself round in the tunnel. It was really not possible, but once he was on his stomach, his knees bending with the tunnel, there was just enough play for Dorathro to force Colin's legs round the angle. Fenoderi jerked his way along with renewed vigour, for this bend was the last great hazard according to his law. Then his sword splashed in water. He twisted his head all ways. He could not see, but his hands brought him bad news. The tunnel dipped, and was flooded to the roof. This had not been so in his father's time. The end of the tunnel was not yet. How far did the water lie? It called for nerves of steel to edge forward into the water, and, at last, under. This moment was to be endured 3 times more, as Susan, Colin, and Dorathro made the choice that was no choice. But once they grappled with the terror, it did not last. For the water had collected in a shallow, U-shaped bend, not 2 yards long, and they all emerged on the other side before their lungs were drained of air. Not much later, the floor began to drop away from the roof, and it was possible to crawl on hands and knees.
"Taken all in all," said Fynoderee, "the Earl Delring has not used us ill. From here we shall be in little danger, provided that we respect the smaller risks."
They now pressed on with all speed, for there could be scarcely an hour of daylight left. They were at the end of a tunnel. It was flooded to a depth of 3 feet, and was sticky with clay, but it was high and not long. At its end rose a shaft that offered few difficulties, for it was composed of a series of inclined pitches, connected by wide shelves, and the top was gained without trouble. From there, a short passage led into a circular cave, and daylight. Above was open sky. Cold, crisp, dry air filled their lungs. After all they had undergone in the barren caves, this scene of beauty, the waning light among the scented pines, was almost unreal.
"It's like a dream," said Susan. "I can even imagine there's music all around us."
"See," said Fynoderee, "on Goldenstone, a stromkarl plays."
On top of a stone sat a young man, less than 3 feet high, plucking the strings of a harp.
"When summer in winter shall come, then shall be danger of war. A crow shall sit at the top of a headless cross, and drink of the noble's gentle blood so free, between 9 and 13 all sorrow shall be done. A wolf from the east shall right eagerly come, to a hill within the forest height, beside a headless cross of stone, there shall the eagle die."
"Why do you sing the old prophecies?" said Durathro. "Are they now to be fulfilled?"
"I do but sing of the summer that has come in winter. Does your road lead to Fundindelv?"
"It does," said Fynoderee, "and we take with us the Weirdstone of Brisingamen."
"I am glad," said the stromkarl.
"But you will not go to Fundindelv."
"How shall we not?"
"The hooded one sits by Holywell, and the shape-shifter watches the gates, and to them are gathering the Morth brood. The Svart Alpha will be there at sunset, and with the night are coming others. No birds will fly save the eyes of the Morrigan. It will be dark within the hour. See to it that you are not under the sky at that time."
And he jumped down on the other side of Goldenstone, and they did not see him again.
"It never crossed my mind that this would be their course,"
said Fynoderee.
"But what is there for us now?" said Durathro.
"Can we get to the farm before dark?" said Colin.
"We should reach the farm," said Fynoderee, "but whether it will be shelter for the night, I cannot be certain."
"What of the stone?"
said Durathro.
"We must find Cadellin," said Fynoderee. "In his hands it will be secure, and he can wield its might for our safekeeping."
"Why, then, give me the stone. He shall have it ere you can reach the farm."
"Do you see those?"
said Fynoderee, pointing across the fields.
"I see, but what of it? Rooks flock homeward daily at this hour."
"Those are not rooks. You would be torn asunder within the minute. They know where Cadellin is as well as I, and that we must find him. I am to meet Cadellin on the summit of Shutlingslow at dawn on the morning of the 4th day from this. There is little hope of finding him sooner. Our greatest task will be to avoid the Morth brood for so long."
They headed for the farm, keeping under cover wherever possible, and came over the riddings as the first stars were shining, and they saw Gowther's solid figure, Scamp at his heels, going the round of the shippons and stables to fasten up for the night.
"Hello," he said. "What have we got here? You look as if you'd been through every marl pit between here and Warnish Nook."
"It is a good story, Farmer Mussock," said Fynoderee, "but I would fain have a roof over my head for the telling of it."
"Wait a minute," said Gowther. "I know thee. You're the feller as threatened me some months back, aren't you? I'd like to know what mischief you've been getting these childer into."
"I mean you no harm, Farmer Mussock, and I crave your help. But every moment we stand here exposed to watching eyes adds to our peril. Let us right our grievances behind locked doors."
"You've got to trust him, Gowther." "You must," cried Susan. "He saved our lives more than once today. And it is dangerous to be out here."
Gowther looked at the children.
"All right," he said slowly. "You can come in, and think on. I want an explanation, and it had best be good."
Fynoderee smiled.
"It will be interesting, Farmer Mossock."
"Well, this is the rummest do I've come across, it is that."
"There's little use in saying pigs canna fly when you see them catching swallows," said Bess.
"And you say as you've got to get our Bridestone to the top of Shutlingslow by Friday morning? Well, that wouldn't be difficult. You two can catch a bus from Macclesfield to Wildboar Clough and then climb up the hill and meet your wizard."
"That would be a dangerous course," said Fynoderee. "We shall go on foot."
"When do we start?" asked Susan.
"At dawn tomorrow. We dare not stay long in any place."
"We?" said Bess.
"Oh, no. If you think you're dragging these two children off on your madcap errands, you can think again." "Oh, but Bess—" "Aye, it's all very well saying, 'But, Bess, look at the state you were in this evening. You can't run risks like that and get away with it every time."
"Colin and Susan must see this through to the end in the company of those best fitted to help them," said Fynoderee.
"They have thwarted evil this day, and it will be a pledge of honour for witch and svart alike to make good that wrong.
It would be madness to leave them unprotected here."
"Yon's a good point," said Gowther. "But we're still responsible, choose how you look at it." He stood up. "I'll be coming with you in the morning."
Everybody's bedding had been brought down into the kitchen, for the dwarfs insisted that they should all stay in the one room that night. Shortly before midnight, Scamp began to growl. Durathro and Fynoderee quietly drew their swords and took up stations either side of the door. All ears were straining to catch the least sound.
"Mossock,"
said a voice just outside the door.
"Mossock, are you there?"
"It is the place woman,"
whispered Durathro to Gowther.
"Aye, I'm here."
"Hand over to us the children, the dwarfs and the stone, and you shall go unharmed. Resist, and your house will fall, and weeds will grow on this land for 100 years. Open this door before we break it."
"Pay no heed," said Fynoderee. "They cannot pass over a threshold unasked. It is an old binding spell stronger than any they can weave."
"Oh, right. Mrs. Place, you cannot come in."
There was a moment's silence before the Morrigan spoke again.
"Do not think that because we cannot enter you are safe. There is no escape, for we have called those to whom such spells are meaningless. Listen, can you not hear them? The Mara are stirring."
Durathro and Fynoderee kept watch by turns throughout the night, and at 6 o'clock they woke the others. Day was near, and there was a hard frost. They slipped quietly out into the lane.
"Cousin Fynoderee, what make you of those clouds to the north?"
Said the dwarf.
"Fimbulwinter?"
"Aye, they do not mean to lose. First they drive us out with the threat of the Mara. Next they watch us through the day, and when we reach some lonely place they pen us close under the Fimbulwinter till night comes, and they can take us as they wish."
"Wait on," said Gowther. "What's all this Fimbulwinter business?" "There are some things better left untold," said Fynoderee.
"You are in our world now, and without us you will not regain your own, even though it lies at your feet."
Gowther looked down at highmost Redmanhay.
"Aye," he said. "You're right."
"Oh, look," said Colin. "We're not the only people out early this morning." In the lane below, a man and a woman, both rucksacked and wearing anoraks, ski trousers and heavy boots, were leaning over a field gate. "There are 2 more behind us on Clinton Hill," said Susan. Sure enough, a quarter of a mile away, 2 hikers gazed at the wide plain and its rim of hills.
"Happen it's a rally," said Gowther. "Ah, it is indeed," laughed Durathro shortly. "Those are witches and warlocks, for I am not my father's son."
"Are they the Morth brood?" said Colin.
"There is the danger," said Fynoderee. "They mingle with others unnoticed. For this reason must we shun all contact with men."
The whale-backed Pennines, in their southern reaches, crumble into separate hills which join up with the Staffordshire moors, and from the Cheshire plain 2 hills stand out above all the rest. One is Bosley Cloud, the other is Shuttling Slow. And 3 days hence, on that ridge, 8 miles from where they now were, Firefrost would be given into safe hands, if the Morth brood could be kept at bay for so long.
Aye, and that's another thing, said Garner. What are we going to do between now and Friday? It's not but half a day's tramp to Shuttling Slow from here.
Hush, said Fenodary.
There are keen ears listening. The where and the when are all they do not know of our plans. For a start, we must try to lose the Morth brood spies in the wood that fringes Radnor Mere. We shall keep to this lane until we come opposite the middle of the wood. There we shall enter, and with luck come out at the far side alone.
But we shall need more luck to remain alone, said Durathor, for I fear that little escapes those eyes.
Above their heads wheeled a cloud of birds. Out over the plain other flocks were sweeping in a very definite pattern, an interwoven net of such efficiency that any one section of the ground was rarely left uncovered. The hikers continued to admire the view. Below them, across the fields, was Radnor Wood.
"I'll tell you what," said Garner. "Tom Enshaw seems to be as mithered with these birds as much as we are. He's getting enough scarecrows any road."
"Aye,"
said Durathor.
"And can you tell me, Farmer Mossock, what need he may have of them on pasture land?"
It was as Durathor said. Every field within sight held a tattered figure with outstretched arms, even those under grass, and with cows in them.
"No time to linger," said Fenodary.
They saw that the 2 hikers who had been leaning over the gate were now walking casually along some distance behind. A flock of 13 birds closed in and began to glide in circles overhead. The road gradually converged on Radnor Wood, until the 2 were running together, with only a low stone wall between them, and at a bend in the road Fenodary said,
"When the Morth doers round this corner, we must be hidden. Now, over the wall."
Brambles were waiting for them on the other side, but they tore themselves free and ran through the scrub and undergrowth. At once the birds began to raise a rumpus, but Durathor, bringing up the rear, saw nothing of the hikers before the trees closed around him. As soon as they were in the shade of the beeches, the prickly undergrowth thinned out, and they made good speed. For a short time the birds screamed overhead, and then they dropped through the branches and circled in and out among the trees, calling assuredly, deliberately, as though relaying information. Fenodary relaxed the pace to a quick walk.
"There is no need to hurry," he said resignedly. "I hoped to find cover while they pondered. This wood did not favour the Morth brood in the elder days."
His words were drowned by an outbreak of screeching above their heads. All round them birds were crashing heavily to earth. Then the woods were still. Durathor turned the bird over with the point of his sword. Embedded under the heart was a small, white-feathered arrow.
"The Leos Alpha," he whispered. "The Leos Alpha."
He put away his sword and looked to the sky.
"Endil! At Lendor! It is I, Durathor! This is well met!"
"Peace," said Fenodary. "They are not here."
"Are they not?" cried Durathor. "Oh, I tell you, cousin Wineskin, if the Leos Alpha have come from exile, there is little we need fear between now and Friday's dawn. At Lendor, welcome! Hermid, Granos!"
Fenodary shook his head sadly.
"The Leos Alpha have been gone from the long wood of Radnor these 200 years. They are not here. None but the Morth brood will answer your call."
"But it can be only the Leos Alpha," said Durathor. "Why do they not know me?"
Fenodary crouched to examine the arrow more closely.
"This is an elven shaft," he said. "Yet still I do not think they are with us."
"Hey up, what's yon?"
said Garner, and pointed into the trees. Something white moved among the branches. It fell gently towards them, swinging backwards and forwards with a graceful, swooping, dipping motion, and landed at Durathor's feet. A white eagle feather.
"See," said Durathor, "a token, and from an elven cloak. What say you now?"
Fenodary looked hard at the feather, and then at Durathor.
"It is the Lios Alpha," he said. Fenodiri urged them on with all speed after the delay. They were making their way down an almost extinct track between rhododendrons of such size that the branches met over their heads, when Fenodiri held up his hand. They stopped, listened. Footsteps. Into the bushes. They forced their way through the glossy hide of leaves into the tangled bare branches that comprised the main bulk of the growth. "Stay wherever you are, and do not move," whispered Durathor. "He's close." It was difficult to see through the bushes in the dappled light. They heard someone approach, but caught only a glimpse of dark clothing. Whoever it was, he was breathing heavily. "Phew, be hanged to old place," muttered a deep voice. It was Mr. Hodgkins, a local businessman. He was clad in thick ski trousers and a hooded anorak, above which protruded the neck of a sweater. Round his neck were snow goggles. Leather gauntlets hung by tapes from his wrist, and down his lined, sallow businessman's face ran rivulets. He put his back against the roots of the tree, took out his handkerchief, and began to mop. 5 pairs of eyes watched him in agony. The children, Gowther, and the dwarves were standing frozen in the most awkward attitudes, cramped, precariously balanced. Any movement would have set the leaves dancing at the end of their branches. It was as though they were dangling in a snarl of burglar alarms. However, James Henry was not one to waste time unduly, and as soon as he was restored to a more even temperature, he pulled himself up and went on his way. "Well," said Gowther, "how'd Hodgkins? 10 years he's been a customer of mine. It just shows you can never tell." "Now, we must run," said Fenodiri. Only when they had put much dense woodland behind them did Fenodiri allow a few minutes for rest. "Cousin," said Durathor, "d'ye hear?" They fell silent, tensely listening. "Aye, it is an axe." They could all hear it now, the clear, rhythmical ring of steel in timber. "I know who yon is," said Gowther. "It'll be Harry Wardle. He's all right. If there's been anybody in this end of the wood today, it's as like as not he'll have seen him. Let's ask him." "Trust no one," said Durathor. "But Harry and I were at school together. He's a good lad." "Speak with him," said Fenodiri. "Durathor and I shall watch. If he is of the moth brood, he will not raise the alarm." They halted at the edge of a clearing. A man was wielding a long-handled felling axe. "How do, Harry?" said Gowther. Harry Wardle turned and smiled. "Hello, Gowther. What's brought thee down here?" "Oh, I'm just out for the day with young Colin and Susan here. Busy morning, Harry." "Fair. Couple more trees to drop after this before dinner. Going far?" "As far as I've a mind to, I expect. Many folks about today, Harry?" "Not a soul till you come along." "Well, if anybody does show up, you not seen us, Reet?" A slow grin spread over Harry Wardle's face. "I never clapped eyes on thee, Gowther." Gowther winked slyly. "Be good, Harry." "Be good, lad." They left him, and a moment later the sound of his axe rang out behind them through the trees. "Well," said Gowther, "what did I say?" "He is no warlock," said Fenodiri, "but it would have been wiser to pass him by." "Listen," said Durathor. "I can't hear anything," said Gowther. "But you should hear something," cried Fenodiri. "Why has your friend's axe been stilled?" "Eh? What?" said Gowther, suddenly flustered. "Here, hold on a minute." But Durathor and Fenodiri were speeding back towards the clearing, drawing their swords as they ran. The clearing was empty. Harry Wardle and his axe were gone. "But," stammered Gowther, "but it's not—" "No, not Harry. No." "Let's be moving, shall we?" said Gowther. "I don't mind admitting I've had a shock." They walked swiftly and carefully, close together, and the swords were naked. Durathor kept glancing upwards at the sky. He was troubled. Then he began to sniff the air. "Is it near, cousin?" asked Fenodiri. "It is. An hour, 2 hours, not more." "Yon warlock with his snow garments removed any doubts," said Fenodiri to Gowther and the children. "The moth brood have called Rimthor to their aid, and the ice giant's breath, the Fimble winter,
is upon us."
The curtness of his speech told them more than the words. The wood declined into timbered parkland, which thinned to open fields, and under the last cluster of trees the dwarfs halted to consider the next move. To their right was the Congleton Road, bordered by a stone wall. On their side of the wall a belt of woodland followed the road, and the open ground between where they were crouching and this thicker cover was sparsely dotted with trees. A flock of birds wheeled overhead. No human figures were to be seen.
"Where may our way lead now?" said Durathro.
"It's a deal too exposed for me," said Garner. "I wish them birds would give it a rest." He scanned the country before them. "It'd be better if we could reach them trees by the wall. Aye, yon's the best road. Happen if we keep an eye open for birds, we can pick our time and dodge about a bit till we're there." And that's what they did. Choosing a moment when the sky was clear, they darted towards the road, weaving from tree to tree, and they reached the strip of woodland before the next patrol flew by. The trees left the road and continued across the fields as Dumville's plantation. For most of its length it was very narrow, but it gave splendid cover from the air. After half a mile the wood curved over the brow of a low hill, and from its edge there was a good view of the surrounding country.
"I wonder who yon is on Sodger's Hump," said Gowther.
They all looked. A mile away, above the crossroads on Monk's Heath, a grassy hill stood out above the land. A group of Scots pines crowned the summit, and outlined among the trees was a man on horseback. He sat motionless.
"There is that about him that strikes a chord of memory," said Durathro, after much peering. "What think you, cousin?"
Fenodary shook his head.
"It is almost certain to be a warlock guarding the crossroad."
But for some time after the dwarfs were withdrawn and pensive. The trees dropped to the Macclesfield road in the hollow where it crossed Bag Brook, and Fenodary shepherded the others to the opposite side of the road and under the bridge arch. The dwarfs, for the first time since the disappearance of Harry Wardle, put away their swords.
"I begin to have hope of this quest," said Fenodary. "We are well clear of Ragnar, and I think the Morth brood have lost the trail. Here is what we shall attempt. North of Shuttlingslow lies Macclesfield Forest. Men have covered much of it with spruce and fir, and there is little chance of finding aught that hides within. The forest will keep us till Friday's dawn, when we shall climb over the last mile of moorland to Shuttlingslow."
Fenodary's plan was to travel, wherever possible, through woods. The intervening stretches of country, he hoped, would be crossed by following the lines of streams. They now fell into a pattern of movement that was to govern them for slow, exhausting miles. They had to keep together as a body, yet move and act as individuals, each finding and gaining cover before birds were overhead, and pushing on as soon as the sky was clear. Desperate scrambles, long periods of inactivity, mud, sand, water, ice, malicious brambles, 1 mile an hour was good progress. The brook led them southwest, crossing under the Congleton Road. A few yards short of the bridge, a tributary joined Bag Brook. Not long after, turning up this smaller brook, they saw the first hikers on the fringe of Dumville's plantation. But ahead towered a sanctuary of larches. No sun cut through the green roof. Here twilight lay hidden at noon.
"It's a treat not to think eyes are boring into your shoulder blades, innit?" said Gowther.
"And to be out of the sun," said Colin. "It was trained on us like a spotlight."
"Well, the light's certainly dim enough in here," said Susan. "It's taken till now for my eyes to get used to the change."
"I mun be still a bit mazed, then," said Gowther, "for to my way of thinking it's coming on darker instead of lighter."
"It is," said Fenodary.
The blue sky and brilliant sun had vanished. From horizon to horizon the air was black and yellow with unbroken clouds.
"These are but the outriders," said Durathro. "Do we stay here beneath shelter or move on?"
"On,"
said Fenodary.
"We shall move soon. The storm is at hand, and at its height it will pluck even the Morth brood from the sky. Then shall we cross."
They did not have to wait. The first snow whipped by as Fenodary finished speaking, and the next moment the world had shrunk to a 5-yard circle, shot through with powdered ice and bounded by a wall and ceiling of leaping grey.
"Naught can find us in this," shouted Fenodary, against the skirl of the wind. "Now is our chance."
Once they were out of the shelter of the wood, the full weight of the storm flung itself upon them. They groped their way together, and linked arms, Gowther in the middle as anchor, and the wind frog-marched them directly to their goal. It was the shallowest of valleys. They bounced over the edge, and were dropped by the storm as it leapt across the gap. Close to where they landed, a fallen tree threw up soil-clogged roots, a natural shield against the wind.
"We shall fare no better than this,"
said Fynoderee. At first it was enough to be out of the storm's reach. The snow hissed past, and little settled. But the air was cruel, and behind the roots there was not much space for 5 people, so they crouched and stood by turns, and the breath froze on their lips, and their eyelashes were brittle with ice. The children huddled to share the dwarfs' cloaks. It was then that Dorathor spoke of the Lios Alfar, and of his friendship with Atlendor.
"It is hard to lose the companionships of elves, and if one has been dearer to you than your own kin, a more than brother right from earliest memory, the loss is nigh unbearable. By Goldenstone we said our farewells, and he gave to me Valham, and I parted with Tarnhelm, the greatest treasure of the Huldra folk."
Dorathor smiled ruefully.
"I exchanged the power of going unseen for the power of flight."
"But why should the elves leave here in the first place?" asked Colin.
"The Lios Alfar," said Dorathor, "are the elves of light, creatures of air, the dew-drinkers. To them beauty is food and life, and dirt and ugliness death. When men turned from the sun and the earth, and corrupted the air with the smoke of furnaces, it was poison to the Lios Alfar. Most went north with Atlendor to far Prydain, and there they dwell upon the high hills." During the afternoon the wind dropped, and the roots were now no shelter from the snow. It fell steadily, monotonously, so that it seemed to the half-frozen figures behind the tree as though they were on a platform that moved upwards through a white, beaded curtain. Reality, space, and time dissolved in the blank, motionless world. Towards nightfall, Fynoderee made up his mind. It was becoming obvious that they could not survive the night in the open. Already they were experiencing the fatal, warm drowsiness of exposure.
"We must move," said Fynoderee. "I shall see if there is better cover downstream. But it would not be wise to go alone. Farmer Mossock, will you come with me?"
"I will that,"
said Gowther. Fynoderee and Gowther disappeared through the curtain. They followed the valley for a quarter of a mile, and came to a cart track near to where it joined the Congleton road.
"Hey," said Gowther, "I know where we are. Straight on'll be Reedsmere, and there's thick woods just ahead. It's the best we'll find round these parts."
"It may be better than you think, my friend," said the dwarf. "I had given no thought to Reedsmere."
They retraced their steps. All the time Gowther had put his feet exactly in Fynoderee's tracks, and his boots had blotted out the dwarf's smaller prints. Going back, they trod the same tracks as on the outward journey. Fynoderee stopped. Something had crossed their path. A shallow furrow, 2 yards wide, had been swept through the snow, and along the centre of the furrow ran the print of bare feet. Each foot was composed of a pointed big toe, divided by a cleft from the single wedge that filled the place where the other 4 toes would normally have been. The prints were evenly spaced, 3 yards apart.
"Hurry,"
gasped Fynoderee. He did not draw his sword. After Gowther and Fynoderee had been gone about 20 minutes, Susan got up to stamp around and flap her arms. She was on the point of crouching down again when she heard a faint swishing sound. Thinking the others were returning, she stood on tiptoe to peer out of the valley, and at that moment a flurry of wind pulled aside the veil of snow. A second later the veil fell back into place, but in that instant Susan's eyes registered every detail of the thing that was passing. It bore some resemblance to a woman, an ill-proportioned woman, 20 feet high and green. The long, thick-set trunk rested on massive legs with curving, bloated thighs. The arms were too short, muscular at the shoulders, but tapering to puny, indeterminate hands. The head was very small and scarcely broader than the neck on which it sat. There was no hair, The mouth was a shadowed line, the nose cut sharply down from the brow between the eyes that were no more than dark smears. It wore a single garment, a loose tunic that reached to the ground and clung to the body in folds like wet linen. The flesh gleamed dully, and the tunic, of the same colour and texture, might have been of the same substance. A statue of polished malachite, but a statue that moved. Dorathro pushed Susan down into the snow. "Lie still." She felt the earth shake beneath a ponderous tread that died away. "Did you see it?" she whispered. "I saw it." Finoderi, with Gowther on his heels, staggered out of the gloom. "Mara, it has this instant gone by," said Dorathro. "It did not see us. There is still too much light." "So did it miss our tracks. Come, we have found shelter." They slipped down the valley as quickly as they dared. "But what are they?" said Susan. "Troll women. From rock are they spawned, and to rock they return if the sun should find them above ground. But by night they are indestructible, all-powerful. Only our wits can save us now, and be thankful we have more than they, for the Mara's brain is as meagre as its strength is great." A thin cry, cold and pitiless as the fangs of mountains, came from behind them. "Run! It has found our trail." They had crossed the path where Finoderi had turned back, and were among the bushes when the Mara called a second time, and now it was near. "Steady!" cried Gowther. "We munna get separated in here." The thicket was not impenetrable, but it was close enough to make it difficult for 5 people to move quickly through it together. The snow was no longer falling, it was almost night. Again the voice. "Stay!" cried Dorathro. They had all heard. It was not an echo. It was an answering call from in front. Immediately there came another from the right, and the sound of snapping branches and rustling undergrowth. Hemmed in on 3 sides, they swung left. The voices were continuous now. Dorathro ran ahead of the rest. Susan was nearest to him, trying to keep in his wake, and as they came to a thick screen of bush, Dorathro forced his way through. Susan's dive after him was halted by a stifled cry from Dorathro, followed by a splash. "What's happened?" Susan put her head through the gap, and looked out across water. In the gathering darkness she could not see any land. Beneath her, to his waist in the water, Dorathro struggled to climb back to the land. "Reedsmere," said Gowther savagely. "I should have thought of that one." "Back," spluttered Dorathro. Colin turned, and the rest hurried after. "Stop!" cried Colin. "There's water here too." "What? There gotta be. Here, wait on a minute." Gowther turned off left and plunged into the bushes. 10 seconds later he was back, only to vanish in the opposite direction without speaking. When he reappeared he was walking very slowly. "I dunna ask anybody to believe this," he said, "but we're on an island." But it can't be an island," said Susan. "I know it canna, but it is." "It's not possible," said Colin. Laughter broke in on their bewilderment. The dwarfs were sitting in the snow, each with his back against a tree. "It is in truth an island," said Dorathro, "and by the blade of Osla, I did not look to such a fair ending to this day's work." "Hush," said Finoderi, "and lie low a while." On the nearer shore, 3 Mara were casting about to pick up the vanished scent. They wailed and whooped and peered at the ground, uprooting bushes and bending trees. Having flattened everything for yards around, the 3 shapes stood on the lakeside, facing out across the water. "This is it," thought Susan. But the Mara did not move. Their bodies merged into the shadows. All was quiet, and then they turned and disappeared into the wood. The whooping broke out again, and continued until all sounds were lost in the distance. "Why didn't they find us?" said Colin. "Anyone with half an eye could have guessed where we were. Our footprints must have ended at the water." "But the Mara have not half a mind," said Finoderi. "Our tracks were all they had to follow, and when they ended, the trail was lost. There were no tracks, therefore there was nothing to find. Their minds look no further than their eyes, and I think that to their eyes this island is hidden." "Is it now?" said Gowther. "You don't surprise me in the least." "This is the Isle of Angharad Goldenhand, the Lady of the Lake," said Finoderi, "and it is one of the 2 floating islands of Logris. It was lodged against the shore when Angharad guided our feet hither.
Here no evil will threaten us. For one night we may lie at peace, and the lady will watch over us."
"Very comforting," said Gowther. Melting snow was sliding down the inside of his collar, and he was tired. "But where is this lady of thine?"
"She is there, though we do not see her, and we are under her protection. Now we must sleep."
Hungry, damp, cold, and thirsty beyond measure, Susan curled up between the roots of a tree. A long night of miseries stretched ahead. Sleep would never come. But come it did. A warm languor crept through her limbs. The snow against her cheek was a pillow of swan's down. Susan slept. It was a curious dream, a mixture of all her waking thoughts, timeless, disjointed, as difficult to hold as an image in rippling water. And then the people and voices and episodes of her dancing brain would fall into place, and become so vivid, so concrete, that there was nothing of dreaming about them. She was sitting with Colin, Gowther, and the dwarfs under the trees of the island. Before them were golden dishes piled high with meats and spices, fruits and cool green cresses. Reedsmere flashed blue in the light of high summer. Angharad Goldenhand sat between the children. She was tall and slender and fair, her long plaited hair like red gold, and on her brow a band of gold. Nothing of their adventures was unknown to her, and she had much to tell. The Lios Alfar, said Angharad, had heard of the capture of Firefrost by Grimnir and the Morrigan. The elf lord Atlendor, son of Nav, had come south to find what truth there was in the tale. When the Stromkarl came from Goldenstone the previous evening, Atlendor decided to go back to his people, since news of Firefrost was good, and there was need of him in Prydain. He dared not stay for words when he put an end to the spies in Radnor Wood. The dream ran on in a world of sunlit laughter, and Stromkarls brought Fenodiri and the children cloaks of red muspel hair, woven from the beards of giants, and lined with white satyr's wool. And there were 4 cloaks sewn together to cover Gowther's broad shoulders. "Take this bracelet of mine," said Angharad Goldenhand. "It will guard you on your journey, and when the other is with Cadellin Silverbrow, think of this as fair exchange. It has many virtues." She took from her arm a band of white metal and fastened it about Susan's left wrist. "May the sleepers lie safe in Fundindelv." The picture dissolved once more, but those golden eyes, full of sunlight, remained steadfast through the wheeling colours of her dream. "Thank you," said Susan. The golden eyes faded. "Thank you." Her voice sounded loudly in her head. Susan knew she was almost awake to a world of snow and hunger and weariness and great peril. One by one her senses returned, and when a drifting snowflake landed gently on her cheek, she groaned, and thrust her head into the crook of her elbow. Instantly Susan forced her eyes open. She was wrapped in a cloak of bronze-red hair, lined with a fleece of curls, and on her wrist was a silver bracelet. The others were awake now. "But it was a dream. It cannot have happened. It was summer, too. There's only our footprints in the snow and all." "But these cloaks—" "And what about this?" said Susan. "Aye, that is a precious gift," said Durathor. "Oh, hello," said Gowther. "I'm glad if somebody here knows what they're about. Witches, boggarts, and green freetings have had to take in one day, and I don't know whether I'm sleeping or waking now. I'm beginning to wonder if I'm dreaming the whole lot." "Men have ever thought dreams are not reality," said Fenodiri. "The Lady of the Lake is a skilled weaver of enchantment. She knew that without help we could not have survived the night. Now, with muspel cloaks upon our backs, we need not fear the cold of Fimbulwinter, even though the ice giants themselves came south. And that gift may be more than all." He pointed to the bracelet. It had an air of great age. It was lightly incised and inlaid with black enamel, and on it was an inscription in heavy, square lettering that was unknown to Susan. "She might have told me what it was for, though. Perhaps it would not do for you to learn all its secrets at a time. Sudden power is a dangerous thing for any hands. Wear this always, guard it as you would the stone, and I know it will not fail you in need." With the first light, the island had grounded close to a stream on the opposite side of Reedsmere from where the Mara had lost the trail. Clothed in the featureless snow, the countryside seemed vast and offered no cover. Any movement against that background would be seen for miles. A line of footprints could not be missed, and in the brittle air any sound would carry undiminished to distant ears. Durathor suggested that their best course was to walk along the actual bed of the stream, but as close to the bank as possible, and so they took up the pattern of the previous day's travel. The muspel cloaks, worn with the lining on the outside and the hood up, were good camouflage. 10 minutes after sunrise, the first bird swept overhead. The morning wore on, monotonously. By noon they had advanced a little over a mile. Then Gowther stopped. "I've been thinking," he said. "Just over yonder is Pythorn Wood, and if I remember, we'll find a stream as will take us in the right direction from there. Shall we have a look?" To gain the wood they had to skirt the edges of a field, cross a lane near to the lodge of Thornycroft Hall, and make their way over 250 yards of exposed parkland. "How are we to gain the wood?" said Fenoddery. "We'll have to chance it," said Gowther. "There's been enough folks gone along this lane and down the drive for our tracks not to stand out a mile. Now, if we flop down in a heap at the side of the drive every time the birds come over, and make sure as we've no bits and pieces sticking out from under our cloaks, we should be all right. I'll go first, so as I can come back and tell you if there's honest nags." The sky was clear. He stepped into the road and walked through the drive gateway and past the lodge. 20 minutes later Susan and Durathor followed, and 10 minutes after Colin and Fenoddery. Pythorn Wood is not large. Much of it is little more than a neck of land dividing the two lakes of Thornycroft Hall, and it was in this part of the wood that they decided to rest for an hour. "We must keep guard by turns," said Fenoddery. They curled up in their muspel cloaks and forgot the snow. Even their ice-bound feet grew warm, and after such a morning sleep was not long in coming. Colin had offered to take the first turn. He sat upon a tree stump and looked about him, seeing the beauty of the day for the first time. The air was still, and the sun shone in a cloudless sky. Pythorn was a wood of lace that day. There had been floes on Reedsmere at dawn, but the ice here was unbroken, thick and blue as steel. Out across the ice was an island, so overgrown with trees that it was as though they sprouted straight out of the lake, and at first that was all Colin could see. But as the minutes went by, something began to take shape within the trees. The impression was strongest when he did not look directly at the island, but even so, he could not be certain that there was anything there. And then, like a hidden figure in a picture puzzle, it came unexpectedly into focus. His yelp of fright brought the dwarfs bounding to their feet. There, among the outer trees of the island, was a man dressed all in black, and seated on a black horse, and his eyes were fixed on Colin. "What is wrong?" whispered Fenoddery, but Colin could only point. The rider began to walk his horse towards them across the ice. In silence they watched him come. "I've been looking for you," he said. "Welcome, Gaberlunzie," said Fenoddery. "Yesterday we saw you from afar, but could not be sure. Will you not come among the trees? The Morrigan and her brood harry us, and the spies are out." The stranger looked at the sky. "I thought there were no birds," he said. He dismounted and brought his horse under the trees. "We must be in Shutlingslow at Friday's dawn to meet Cadellin Silverbrow, or the world we know may not endure," said Fenoddery. "Will you stay with us and help us?" "I shall not bide," said Gaberlunzie. "I am needed in Prydain within the week, and must turn northwards this day. But what help there is in me you shall have before I go. If I leave you at the forest by nightfall, will that serve you well?" "That would almost end our labours," said Fenoddery. "But alas, we dare not move openly. By day the skies are watchful, and by night the Mara walk. We crawl on our bellies to our noble end." "But now you will ride," laughed Gaberlunzie. "Look!" cried Susan. They had not noticed the mist come creeping over the snow.
Like a white smoke it curled among the trees and eclipsed the far end of the lake.
"Grimnir," said Durathro.
"Whist now," said Gaberlunzie. "It's nothing of the sort. It's what I've been expecting. Cloudless skies, snow, such frost as this, and darkness not 2 hours away. What more natural than a good white mist to blind the moth brood and speed us on our road? Now, on to my horse and away." The fog was about them, absolute.
"You hold on a minute," said Gowther. "Before we try to fit 6 on one horse, I'd like to know how you think we're going to find our way in this lot. Do not worry, friend. My eyes are not your eyes, and my horse is not of earthly stock. We shall not stumble. But come, mount." And they did mount. Durathro and Fanodary bunched together in front of Gaberlunzie. Behind him sat the children, and behind them Gowther, his arms on either side of Colin and Susan, holding Gaberlunzie's cloak in his fists. Gowther expected to come off within a minute of starting, but a flick of the rein and they were away like the wind. No horse ever sped so smoothly. Fields, hedges, ditches flowed under its hoofs. The snow muffled all noise of their passage as they plunged through the mist. And so they came into the hills, and down to a lonely road in a valley. "We're in the forest now," said Gaberlunzie. He swung his horse off the road, and in one leap they were among the trees. A broad path cut upwards through the close-set ranks, and here Gaberlunzie slowed to a walk. "I shall not stop. You must leave as best you may, so that my trail will be unbroken. Do not stop to cover your own, but look for a place of shelter. Later you'll see foxes. Do not harm them." They tumbled into the snow. Durathro was the last to leave, and as he picked himself up, the form of Gaberlunzie blended into the mist and passed out of his sight forever. The trees grew only a few feet apart, and the sweeping branches came close to the ground, so close that even the dwarfs had to crawl. They went downhill from the path a good way before Fanodary stopped.
"Here will be as safe as anywhere. Even without the mist you can see no more than a few yards. Let us make ourselves as comfortable as we can, for we shall not stir again until we go to greet Cadellin."
Down the path through the forest 2 slim shadows moved. Coming to the trampled snow and the trail leading under the branches, they stopped and sniffed. And then they began to roll and frolic all around. 2 foxes sporting on a winter hillside. When every trace of human feet was obliterated, they set off down the trail, throwing the snow into confusion as they fought.
"Now, yon's what I call clever," said Gowther. "And the scent of a fox is stronger than that of either men or dwarfs," said Durathro, smiling.
He smiled again, alone to himself in the night, when he heard the baying of hounds pass over the hill and fade into the far distance. No one slept much all through the second and last night in the forest. Tension mounted with every hour. But at last Fanodary said,
"Dawn is not far off. Are we ready?"
They climbed up the path. The marks of hoofs were still there, but they were overlaid with many tracks. Hound, Svart, and others. After a long drag uphill, they came above the forest onto a bleak shelf of moorland, and out of the far side of the plateau, half a mile distant, the last 200 feet of shuttling slow reared black against the paling night.
"Yonder it is," said Durathro. "But shall we ever reach it?"
The snow lay deep upon the moor. Not a tree could be seen in the gloom, only a dark line of wall cut across the landscape. Once committed to this waste, once they had made their mark, there could be no drawing back.
"Come on,"
said Gowther. "Let's be doing." And he strode off toward Shuttling Slow. It was a hard trek, and a stiff climb at the end of it, but both were achieved without sight of the moth brood or any of their kind. They lay panting on the flat summit ridge. All about them was nothing but the air. Fanodary reckoned that dawn was less than half an hour away. All eyes strained to pick out Cadellin as soon as he should appear. It grew lighter. North, south, and east the hills rolled away, and to the west the plain, a lake of shadow into which the night was sinking. "Isn't it time we were seeing him?" Colin asked. He could now see the straight track they had drawn across the plateau.
"The sun has not yet risen,"
said Fanodary.
"He will come."
But he did not come, and soon they could no longer pretend it was night.
"It looks like being a grand day," said Garner. "Friday the 13th and all."
"Aye," said Dorathro.
"Between 9 and 13 all sorrow shall be done."
Their trail stood out as clearly as if it had been painted black, and there was no Cadellin. Occasional specks moved singly or in groups across the white backcloth of hills, and, out on the plain, from Alderley Edge, drifted what might have been a plume of smoke, but was not.
"Now that they are astir," said Dorathro, "Cadellin must needs come quickly, or he will come too late."
As it gained height, the column of birds split into patrolling flocks. One headed toward Shuttlingslow. The leader swung round in a tight circle over the line of footprints and brought the flock slowly along the trail close to the ground.
"Do not move," whispered Fynoderee. "It is our only chance."
The muspel cloaks were not proof against keen eyes at close range. The whole flock shot skywards and broke north, south, east and west to din the alarm. One or two remained and cruised in beady silence. The specks in the distance changed course and began to move toward Shuttlingslow. More appeared, and more still, and distant thin voices were raised in answer to the summons, and mingled with them the whine of the Mara and a baying note that the children had heard once before at St. Mary's Cliff. From all over the plain, clouds of birds were rushing eastwards. Dorathro stood up.
"Is this the end of things, cousin?"
"It may be."
"Where is Cadellin, Silverbrow?"
"I cannot think, unless it be that he is dead or prisoner, and either way, we are lost."
The birds attacked. In a cloud they fell, clawing and pecking and buffeting with their wings, and their attentions were directed against Susan above all. But Dernwyn and Widowmaker were among them. Backwards and forwards along the crest the conflict raged, until the ground was red and black, and still they came. A quarter of their number had been hewn from the air before they abandoned the fight.
"It is well they broke," panted Fynoderee, "for I was near spent."
"Aye," said Dorathro, "it'll go hard with us if they come again."
"And yon have not been idle, sithee," said Garner. The Morth brood were pouring in from all sides. Only to the southwest was the land not thickly dotted with running figures, and out of the valley of Wildboar Clough came a band of Svarts, 500 strong. There was no Cadellin.
"Can we stem this flood, cousin?"
said Fynoderee. Dorathro shook his head.
"By weight of numbers they will conquer, but we must draw what teeth we may before we go down to rest. And it is how I would wish to die, for so have I lived."
"Well, I'm not going to let them have the stone as easily as that," cried Susan. "You stay if you like, but I'm off."
And she started down the hill towards where the numbers of the Morth brood were thinnest. Over Pigford Moor Susan ran, flanked by dwarfs with gleaming swords. Dorathro looked behind him. The Svarts, with their snow-skimming feet and the tireless bobbing liblacks, had outstripped the Morth brood, and they had at their head one that was worse than all, a Mara, grey and terrible. And before the Mara ran the 2 hounds of the Morrigan, their blind heads low to the scent, and their mouths hanging red.
"Stay not for me!"
shouted Dorathro, facing about. The hounds were well ahead of the Mara, and the first, drawing near, slowed to a walk, ears pricked forward. "Ha!" cried Dorathro. The hound paused. "Ha!" And as it leapt, he thrust upwards with both hands to his sword, and the beast was dead before it hit the ground. But it wrenched Derwin from Dorathro's grasp in its fall, and then the other sprang. Dorathro was lightning itself in battle, and the teeth closed not on his throat, but on his forearm, which he rammed between the wet jaws, and over he went, hurled onto his back by the weight of the monster, and while they wrestled, the Mara strode by unheedingly. Dorathro found the dagger at his waist, and the end was quick. But he could do nothing to save the others. Already the Mara towered over them. Fynoderee launched himself upon it, but Widowmaker flew from his hands in a shower of sparks at the first blow, and leaning down from its 20 feet of grim might, the troll grasped Susan by the wrist and plucked her from the ground. The scream that cut the air stopped Svarts and Liblacks in their tracks, and even the birds were hushed. Again the piteous cry, but weaker now. Limp in the snow, just as she had fallen, was Susan. Beside her was the Mara, and it was shrinking. Its contours melted into formlessness as it dwindled. All movement ceased, and there on the moor top stood a rough lump of rock. Half unconscious, Susan could only stare at Angharad's bracelet, dented and misshapen from the grip of the stone-cold hand that had fastened upon her wrist. "Are you all right, lass?" "I'm not hurt. It was the bracelet, I think. What's happened?" The Svarts and Liblaks were in confusion. Dorathro faced the crowd and spoke in a voice for all to hear.
"See how the invincible perish. If such is the fate of the marrer, how shall you endure our wrath? Let him who loves not life seek to follow further."
The mob slunk back. And then Dorathro saw what he had lost all hope of seeing. A lone man on the top of Shutlingslow. And as he looked, he saw the tall figure leave the crest and begin to descend. Dorathro joined the others. They too had seen. "But I dunno think yon bunch have," said Gowther. "Now, how are we going to hold out while he gets here?" "It's an hour's journey over this ground," said Fenodary. The Morthbrood were conferring with the Svarts. The Morrigan, in her black robes, was screaming furiously.
"Cowards! Liars! They are but 5. Take them! Take them now!"
Fenodary did not wait for more. "Come," he said, "we must make a stand against them."
"A circle!" shouted Gowther. "Colin, Susan, into middle!"
And so they took their stand, and all evil closed upon them. Back to back, the dwarfs and Gowther fought, and in between crouched the children. Fenodary and Dorathro wove a net of light with their swords as they slashed and parried and thrust, and when Gowther swung his stick, skulls split and bones cracked. Their one hope was to survive until the wizard came, but where an enemy fell there was always another to take his place, and another, and another, and another, and another. Gowther's stick was knocked from his hands, but he bent and took up a Svart hammer in either hand, and from that moment the slaughter increased. Following his example, the children snatched themselves weapons and entered into the fight. And thus for a while the battle ran their way. But it was the last flare of a guttering candle before the night swamps all. The end came suddenly. A Svart hammer crashed home above Fenodary's elbow, and the bone snapped with the noise of a whiplash. His sword-arm hanging useless, Dorathro pushed out his free hand behind him. "The stone! Give me the stone!" Susan took off the chain bracelet and hooked it about Dorathro's wrist. Dorathro sprang into the air. Valham enfolded him, and he turned toward Shutlingslow in a last attempt to save the stone. And the birds fell upon him. He disappeared from sight. His sword flashed through the smoke of birds, and the earth grew dark with their bodies. But there were also white eagle feathers with blood upon them, and their number grew. The battle on the ground was done. All eyes were upon that in the air. Nothing of Dorathro could be seen as the cloud moved slowly away, but few birds were dropping now. Lower down the hillside, a round knoll stood out from the slope, topped by a thin beechwood, and on its crown a tall pillar of gritstone jutted to the sky. Clulo was its name. Over this mound the last blow was struck. A white object fluttered out of the base of the mass, hovered for a moment, pitched forward, and crashed through the trees and lay still. Down rushed the Liblaks and Svarts, howling. At the noise the figure stirred. Dorathro raised his head. Then he hauled himself upright and began to walk up the hill. He lurched from tree to tree. His shirt was ripped half from his back, and Valham hung in ribbons. So Dorathro came to the pillar of stone. He put his back against it and unclasped his belt. Loosening it, he threw it round the column and buckled it tightly under his arms so that he should not fall. He grasped Dernwyn in both hands and waited. The Svarts halted, none wanting to be the first to meet that sword.
"There is the stone!"
cried Shapeshifter from behind.
"Take it!"
"Gondamar!"
thundered Dorathro. Where he found the strength is a mystery and a great wonder. But such was his fury that none could withstand him. Not even Arthog, lord of the Svart Alfar, that was as big as a man. In the thick of the press he came against Dorathro, and Dorathro brought his sword round in an arc. The Svart parried with his hammer, but Dernwyn clove through the stone, and Arthog's head leapt from his shoulders. But no sword can shear through stone unpunished, and at the next stroke the blade snapped halfway to the hilt. Yet still de Rathror fought, and none who faced him drew breath again, and the time came when the Svarts and Liblaks fell back to the trees to regain their strength and to prepare a last assault. De Rathror sagged in his harness, and the stump of Dernwyn hung by his side. His head dropped forward onto his chest, and a silence lay upon the hill. Grimnir ran. Fear, excitement, greed drove him. From the top of Shutlingslow he had watched the chase right to the fall of the Mare, and he had seen something else, something approaching rapidly away to the north, and although he had been on his guard against danger from that quarter for months, the form it had taken and the time it had chosen to appear could not have disturbed him more. He came unnoticed over the hill above Clulow. Above the clearing in the wood circled a carrion crow. It spiraled down and came to rest on top of the standing stone. A long time it perched there, watching, motionless, and then the crow launched itself into the air and resumed its measured glide. Closer to the drooping warrior it came, closer, closer, and settled on his shoulder. But de Rathror did not move. His trial was over. A sigh rose through the trees, and the crow hopped from the dwarf's shoulder to the ground. Straight to his wrist it went, and from there back to the pillar, with Firefrost dangling at its beak. A yell of triumph burst forth on every side. Grimnir cast a quick glance over his shoulder. Swiftly he strode down the hill and pushed through the Morth brood, and as he went a new cry moved with him, for in turning to see who was coming from behind, the crowd looked beyond him and panicked. Colin, Susan, Gowther, and Fanauderi had watched de Rathror's battle in an agony of helplessness. Then Grimnir came upon them. "Kill them," he said to the guards. For the first time in memory or legend Grimnir had spoken, and the voice was the voice of Cadellin. The Morth brood was scattering in all directions, for this is what they saw. Racing out of the north was a cloud, black and monstrous, and in shape a ravening wolf. Its loins fell below the horizon, and its lean body arched across the sky to pouncing shoulders and a head with jaw agape, that even now was over the far end of the valley. Eyes glowed yellow with lightning, and the first snarls of thunder were heard above the cries of the Morth brood. There was one thought in all their minds, escape. But when Managarm of Ragnarok is about his master's bidding, such thoughts are less than dreams. Grimnir entered the wood. The crow was still there, squatting on the pillar, its head deep in its shoulders, glaring at the oncoming cloud. It saw Grimnir on the edge of the clearing, read his purpose in a flash, and sprang. But Grimnir was too agile. He jumped, snatched high, and his fingers closed about the bird's scaly shins and swept it out of the air. The other thin, gloved hand wrenched Firefrost from its beak. Grimnir cast the heap of feathers against the pillar and fled. "Hey up," said Gowther. "Here he comes again, and he's getting thy bracelet." Grimnir leapt onto the wall and stood poised as though staring at something in the lane. Then he turned and ran back down the hill. But Grimnir had barely left the wall when he staggered, and a cry broke from him, and he toppled onto his hands. A double-edged sword stood out from his back. Along the blade coiled 2 serpents of gold. Slowly Grimnir rose, until he was on his feet. The sword dropped to the ground. He took 3 steps, swayed, and fell backwards. The deep cowl slid from his face. It was the face of Cadellin twisted with pain, but nevertheless Cadellin. Kind, noble, wise, his silver beard tucked inside the rank green habit of Grimnir the Hooded One. Susan was out of her mind. Colin could not think. Fanauderi wept. Then there was a crunching of rock above them, and they looked up. Someone was climbing over the wall. It was Cadellin. He came towards them over the snow, and his eyes too were full of tears. Cadellin dropped on one knee beside Grimnir and the tears spilled onto his cheeks. "Oh, Govannon," he whispered. "Govannon." Grimnir opened his eyes. "Oh, my brother, that it should come to this, and at my hand." Grimnir twisted his head towards the wood. Among all the scuttling, one figure moved with purpose, and that was Selina Place, who was running towards the little group, her robes streaming behind her. Grimnir brought his head round and stared at his brother, but he did not speak. Their eyes spoke through the barrier of years and across the gulf of their lives. Again Grimnir turned to Selina Place. She was close. He looked up into the smoking jaws of Managam, then at Cadellin. A smile touched his mouth, and he lifted his fist and dropped the stone into Cadellin's hand. Cadellin took up the sword and sheathed it. He turned to the Morrigan. Cadellin held up Firefrost for her to see. "Get you to Ragnarok!" Selina Place shrieked and ran, and as she ran a change came over her. She seemed to bend low over the ground, and she grew smaller. Her robes billowed out at her side, her thin legs were thinner, her squat body heavier, and then there was no Selina Place. Only a carrion crow rising into a sky of jet. "Gowther Mossack," said Cadellin. "Stand here in front of me. Colin, Susan, stand on either side. Take hold of my robe. Do not let go. Fenodiri, sit by our feet. Cling fast to my hem. Is Durathron not with you?" "He is here," said Fenodiri, "but he will not come again." All the sky to the north and east was Wolfhead. The mouth yawned wider till there was nothing to be seen but the black cavernous moor, rushing down to swallow hill and valley whole. Witches, warlocks, svarts, liblaks stampeded southwards. The birds outdistanced them all, but they were not swift enough. One bird alone did not go south. It flew towards the advancing shadow, climbing ever higher until it was a black dot against a blacker vault, and even a dwarf's eyes could not tell if it did clear the ragged fangs that sought to tear it from the sky. As the hill slid down the boundless throat, Cadellin lifted his right hand and held Firefrost on high. Gowther stood firm. Colin and Susan clasped their arms about Cadellin's waist, and Fenodiri grappled to him with his one good arm as much of the wizard's robes as he could hold. "Drochs, Moroch, Essenaroth!" A cone of light poured down from the stone, enclosing them in a blue haze. A starving wind, howling like wolves, was about them, yet the air they breathed was still. Slanting yellow eyes were seen dimly through the veil, hungry eyes, and there were other noises and other shapes that were better left unknown. The fury raged and beat against the subtle armour, but it was nothing to the power of Cadellin Silverbrow, with Firefrost in his hand. And at last, at once, the darkness passed, and the blue light faded. In the sunlight of a brilliant sky they looked out over fields of white, wind-smoothed and empty. No svart or liblak stained the snow, no gaunt figure lay close by. The pillar of Clulo was bare. Away to the south, a black cloud rolled. There was joy, and many tears. And this tale is called the Weirdstone of Brisingamen. And here is an end of it.